This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
And welcome back to another episode of Art of Darkness. I am Brad Kelly. That, you can't see him because it's audio only. That is Kevin Kautzman.
This in the theater of the mind. Imagine me. I'm here. Hi, we're back. Two episodes, 2 days in a row.
Yeah, that's right. Artofdarkpod.com, patreon.com/artofdarkpod, twitter.com/artofdarkpod, all those things. We are back and we are talking today about John Kennedy Toole. But first, we have to talk about our guest who is honoring us with his presence. The great, and a lot of people out there don't maybe know yet how great Dan Baltic, author of the forthcoming book Nut Cranker, which is a certified laugh your ass off banger. Absolute banger. Look out
double
for
banger.
It. Yep.
Yes. Coming soon.
Coming soon.
In the spirit of Toole and in the spirit of Confederacy of Dunces, in the highest praise and the highest sense possible. So we're happy to have Dan on here to talk about.
And Dan, and Dan is also co-host of a great podcast, New Right, which is in some ways it feels like our sister podcast or something, or we're its sister podcast.
Our gender fluid polycule, non-binary poly. We have a podcast polycule.
But yeah, no, great to be here. Thank you for inviting me on.
Of course.
I've been you both have been guests on New Right. And I have long been a fan of Art of Darkness, as I think I tweeted today that you guys put in the work, as they say. And honestly, I'm bowled over by the amount of work and effort that goes into producing an AoD episode.
Yeah.
So
you saw behind the scenes now. My whole
I know it's
insanity process.
it's impressive and indeed humbling and intimidating to see behind the scenes all the work that goes into it.
Oh, it's gonna be good, man. And you know the book, and I listened to, for folks who maybe want some additional John Kennedy Toole stuff. There's an episode of New Right, you and your co-host Matt Pegas, who have on John Kennedy Toole, which is great. You guys are going into, I think, some of the same territory we're going to cover. We lean a little bit more biographical, but I think these are going to serve as kind of yin yang episodes for anybody who's really trying to get John Kennedy Toole build completely.
Absolutely. To get dunced.
Our
episode was on the consolation of podcasting, which is a call out to his favorite book by Boethius, On the Consolation of Philosophy. Mm-hmm. And we focused more on dunces and on its thematic relationship to the world of today, the current year, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But in this episode, we're going to go, from what I understand, way more in depth into the man himself, his life, and in fact, his other novel that he wrote too. Many people don't know this.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about that. That's going to be really cool because I didn't know a whole lot about it, and so it's going to be really interesting to talk about. I didn't know a whole lot about John Kennedy Toole, the person, so I want to start throwing a question to Kevin, which is our standard opening question. Kevin, what do you know about John Kennedy Toole?
Here's what I know. For whatever reason, because the character in Dunces is kind of a portly guy, I imagine he might have been heavy, but this is purely in my imagination. But also, here's all I know is he's from New Orleans. He wrote the great comic novel, Confederacy of Dunces, which I believe for which he was awarded the Pulitzer posthumously because he could not in his lifetime or get it published. And I believe his mother rather doggedly pursued publication after her son's demise at his own hands. And the book became a Pulitzer Prize winning phenomenon after the fact. I have heard whiffs of the idea that he had another piece of juvenilia, a novel he wrote when he was younger that may not be that bad. And that, aside from the New Orleans connection, he's from New Orleans, I believe, that is really all I know about the great American novelist, or at least a novelist of one of the greatest comic novels from the United States, John Kennedy Toole. So what am I going to learn here today, Brad?
That's all right. He was kind of maybe a little overweight. I wouldn't say sort of cartoonishly the way that Ignatius Riley might be, but he packed some pounds around, but also was kind of a handsome looking guy too at the same time. So we're going to get into it. That's all totally right.
Okay, good. Yeah. Before we get any further, what are we going to include for the After Dark episode, which is exclusive to Patreon people? We got to keep hammering the Patreon. It's patreon.com/artofdarkpod. This is an effort pod. We put the work in. Like Dan said, Dan's been behind the scenes. He's seen, what's going on. We've got the machine elves working in the background.
It's intimidating. It's frightening. You guys are constantly on DMT. It's very
well. This is how we channel the spirits of dead artists. But of course, every that's what we do. This is a seance. Every episode of Art of Darkness. So, but every episode we give an extra 20 or 30 minutes to our Patreon subscribers. We also have some other fun things in the works. If you want to get in at $3, you got to do it here before Jan 1 of 2023, because then we're going to up the minimum barrier to entry to $5. So please support the show, get the extra bonus content. Brad, what are we going to talk about today on the After Dark?
Yeah, we're going to explore the question of, was John Kennedy Toole homosexual? And the only reason this is of interest is it's still not clear. So we're going to talk about this. There's arguments on all sides of it, and it's actually a kind of an interesting story, but we're going to save that. We're going to save that for the After Dark. We might also talk a little bit about the question of, is the Confederacy of Dunces film adaptation cursed? Which
that's an interesting question.
Oh, I did not know there was a film adaptation.
Oh, there is not.
There is many
attempts. Many attempts that for some reason never seem to work out.
Right. Well, and of course he was a
keep
Kennedy.
Dying.
So.
People keep dying. Exactly.
Yeah. His middle name is Kennedy. So okay. All right. Interesting. Right. Very good.
So let's kind of launch into it. I want to. You said, Kevin, the great comic novel. You're correct about it being posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize. It was only the third posthumous Pulitzer, but the other two were well-known writers already. One was Faulkner, and one was I'm blanking on it, and I'm not sure I have it here. But this is the only posthumous debut to win a Pulitzer, right? So that's a pretty significant asterisk to put next to this book. Here's a couple other lists and things that it's been on, just to give you a sense of the impact in the, not just in the cult hit sense, but in the main sort of mainstream literary sense. It's voted by the Oxford American as 12th best Southern novel of all time, and there's some stiff competition on that list. 15th on the Cone Book Distributor's top 100 books of the last century. 43rd on Entertainment Weekly's top 100 novels. It's on the best books ever list by bookdepository.com, the top 100 novels by University of Wisconsin. It's in the Great American Read by PBS, 1001 books you must read before you die at thebook.com. 100 novels that shaped our world by the BBC. What is the best work of American fiction of the last 25 years? ? By the New York Times. Number 6 is John Kennedy Toole's Confederacy of Dunces.
Whoa.
Esquire put it in the 80 books every man should read. And Book Riot has put it in the 100 greatest novels between 1893 and 1993. So anybody who writes about books, thinks about books, makes lists, whatever, has some place for Confederacy of Dunces, right? And I wanted to highlight that because, Kevin, as you said, there's something about the fact that this wasn't published in his lifetime that's caught up with the fact that he committed suicide. We're going to look closer at that story and get a better sense of what actually happened there, but they are entangled with each other for sure. So I just kind of wanted to lay that out there. I think maybe but this is, I kind of want to throw it to Dan. Dan, I think you had a passage maybe queued up to read just to kind of give people who maybe aren't familiar with the novel or haven't read Confederacy of Dunces in a long time, just give us a sense of what we're dealing with.
We have a couple of good passages to pick from here, but I think this one is one that gives us the greatest sense kind of Ignatius's psychology and the style of writing and indeed the theme of the novel. So to wit, Ignatius pulled his flannel nightshirt up and looked at his bloated stomach. He often bloated while lying in bed in the morning contemplating the unfortunate turn of events that had taken place since the Reformation. Dora's stay in Greyhound scenic cruisers, whenever they came to mind, created an even more rapid expansion of his central region. But since the attempted arrest and the accident, he had been bloating for almost no reason at all. His pyloric valve snapping shut indiscriminately and filling his stomach with trapped gas which had character and being and resented its confinement. He wondered whether his pyloric valve might be trying, Cassandra-like, to tell him something. As a medievalist, Ignatius believed in the Rota Fortunae, or Wheel of Fortune, a central concept in De Consolatione Philosophiae, the philosophical work which had laid the foundation for medieval thought. Boethius, the late Roman who had written the Consolatione, while unjustly imprisoned by the emperor, had said that a blind goddess spins us on a wheel, that our luck comes in cycles. Was the ludicrous attempt to arrest him at the beginning of a bad cycle? Was his wheel rapidly spinning downward? The accident was also a bad sign. Ignatius was worried. For all his philosophy, Boethius had still been tortured and killed. Then Ignatius's valve closed again, and he rolled over on his left side to press the valve open. "Oh, Fortuna, blind, heedless goddess, I am strapped to your wheel," Ignatius belched. "Do not crush me beneath your spokes. Raise me on high, divinity." "What are you mumbling about in there, boy?" his mom asked through the closed door. "I am praying," Ignatius answered angrily. "Patrolman Mancuso's coming today to see me about the accident. You better say a little Hail Mary for me too, honey." "Oh my God," Ignatius muttered. And I think that gives us a pretty good sense of the man that Ignatius is.
Yes.
The preoccupations on his mind, and maybe even a little hint of the sort of life and the trouble that he has gotten himself into, and continues to.
And it all goes back to Martin Luther banging nailing those treaties onto
the Reformation.
It really
has
does.
been a disaster. It's hilarious.
Yeah, the Reformation and its consequences for Ignatius's digestion.
A not uncommon refrain today, to tell you the truth. So exactly. This is in many respects a very prescient novel.
It is because it's crazily timely.
Yeah.
Well, let's before we get too deep into it, Dan, I want to make sure we're talking about, because I feel like you're the John Kennedy Toole guy now. Like, if you decide you can be like the name that people associate with him. What does this book mean for you? What is it like? How does it occupy your mind? How does it occupy your creative process? What does it mean to you? And in relation to Nutcracker, or however you want to talk about it.
Okay, so I recently wrote a novel which is about to be published called Nutcracker, and this novel, after I finished writing it, I had a sense that it was in some respects similar to A Confederacy of Dunces. So I went back, I started rereading Dunces, and I realized, oh my God, John Kennedy Toole must have burrowed into my subconscious, because in many respects, this feels like a Confederacy of Dunces of today. And so Dunces has certainly influenced my writing, but beyond that, it is something that has influenced my my thoughts about literature, my thoughts about what makes a good novel. And I mean, the way I think of Dunces is it's a sort of picaresque adventure, and that is, first and foremost, it's the life and times of this incredibly psychologically complex and hilarious figure, Ignatius J. Reilly, as he lives his kind of crazy life in New Orleans in the 1960s. And so beyond the actual thematic content of the novel, which we'll get into, the style and the substance of it, I relate to that very strongly, because John Kennedy Toole, and this is in stark contrast to his earlier work. It's almost strange, the transformation he made as a writer from his teenage years. But by the time he wrote Dunces, this novel is told not entirely from the perspective of Ignatius, though mostly from Ignatius's perspective, though it maintains a close third person perspective. But nevertheless, that there are variations which indicate that yes, this is an Ignatius chapter. Yes, this is a Lana Lee chapter, and et cetera, et cetera. But the technique that he employs throughout all of this is something that on New Right, my literary podcast, we've talked about a lot. Dramatic irony. And so that is the technique where you are essentially creating a bond between the author and the reader, and the author is winking at the reader because you both know that the character is behaving absurdly, insanely, in a way that is totally out of bounds of like decorum, and you understand that the author knows how crazy this sounds, which makes it all the more hilarious when it happens.
Yeah, that's one of the delights of Nutcracker, is like you can see where Spencer Grunhauer, the main character, much like in Confederacy of Dunces, you can see the absurdity that he's walking himself into, sort of absurd traps he's laid for himself that he's walking into, and that he can't see it. And yes, that's such a beautiful effect. It actually makes me think of, Nutcracker makes me think of Confederacy of Dunces. I remember, just coincidentally, I happened to read Don Quixote and then Confederacy of Dunces, not in any thought that they were related to each other or anything. They just happened to be the two books in a row that I read, and thinking like, this is like almost the same.
Absolutely.
Like, they're the very similar stuff, because there's definitely that humorous dramatic irony thing going on in Don Quixote. I mean, that was maybe the sort of exemplar of it for several hundred years, Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, a friend of both of our pods, Astral, said that rather than Dunces, he thought that Nutcracker was like a direct heir to Don Quixote. Oh, and I'm nice. Well, thanks, Astral. That's great.
That's high praise.
Welcome to be the direct heir to Don Quixote.
Yeah,
but
Astral doesn't mince words. Astral always goes for big air. It's big air or nothing at all. I love it. I love it.
No, I would say, like, definitely Dunces is in the tradition of Quixote. Well, all novels are in some sense in the tradition of Quixote, but very much that is the case with Dunces. That is the case with Nutcracker, and this concept of dramatic irony. I think that's where actually a lot of today's humor comes from. When you think of great satiric novels, contemporary satiric novels, you think of maybe Sam Lipsyte. You think of maybe, not really Philip Roth, but in some respects, you think of, Kingsley Amis, and it definitely dramatic irony is something that
even something I'm sorry to talk over you, but even something like Palahniuk and Fight Club is very humorous. There's a lot of humor in Palahniuk. Yeah.
There's just this sense that like the reader and you, the author, know that what is happening is insane, but the characters, they are just, players on the stage. Right. They don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, to go back to Dunces, that's one of the reasons why I like it thematically and stylistically, but also there was a great New Yorker article about this, and I hesitate to say a great New Yorker article because there are so few, but this was a good one, and at least so few these days. And this was about how Ignatius is a proto-edgelord, and in many respects, like Ignatius, as we'll get into him and describe him in greater detail, well, this is a man who is unemployed. Well, that's part of the novel. He tries to find work and can't really keep a job. So he's essentially living with his mother. He is a NEET, not in education,
employment or training.
Or training. There we go.
Yeah.
And so that is who he is. And in addition to that, he is a monarchist. He is a Christian humanist. He is a Catholic. And he believes that the correct form of government would be some form of integralism.
Right.
So I ask you, is this a figure that we might be, recognize today? A monarchist integralist who is a NEET and lives at home? Perhaps did this anticipate the current moment a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. He nailed.
Don't forget it. Bloated.
Bloated
Probably. Yeah.
we may get sued by certain internet personalities.
This episode is going to be one long subtweet.
Well, that was excellent. I feel like we've got a good our sort of places set now. We all kind of know what we're talking about with Confederacy of Dunces, and I think we're going to get into this guy who wrote it. So, John Kennedy Toole, as we know, went by various names, and this is actually, I think, important to start to understand what this guy was like. He would go by John with some people, by Ken with some people, and also by Kenny with some people, right, during different times of his life, sometimes simultaneously. This group calls me John, this group calls me Ken. It's basically a middle-class family in New Orleans, born December 17th, 1937. He died in 1969 at the age of just 31 years old. As we said, at his own hand, never having published a word since his earliest college days.
That's terribly tragic, and I'm sure we're gonna get to it. And this is Art of Darkness, so we do tend to focus on the dark side of creativity. That's what the show is about. That's the little the hook, the shtick, if you will. And the suicides are never fun.
This one's tough too.
I don't like so take care of yourself out there.
We're gonna get to it. It's a bummer, but it's also, I think it does actually tell us a lot about creativity and psychology. I think this is actually one of these we talk about, like, what we talk about, what is the art of darkness, this is a classic case. This is a perfect example for the show.
Can I predict? Can I predict we're going to have some serious mommy issues? Mommy issues?
Yeah, Kevin.
I believe so.
Okay, cool. All right, good.
Yeah. So my next line in my outline is first, his mother. Thelma Toole, also her maiden name was Thelma DeCoing, and I cannot say that with the proper New Orleans accent, but Thelma de Coing was a descendant of Jean-Francois de Coing, who was born in France in 1776 and came to colonial Louisiana working as a tinsmith in the French Quarter, right? So just in your mind's eye, tinsmith in the French Quarter, this is where part of John Kennedy Toole comes from. Now, in 1815, towards the end of the War of 1812, de Coing, Toole's great-grandfather, right? Great-grandfather, yeah. Took charge of a single heavy mortar in the Battle of New Orleans, right? This is the War of 1812. And he was injured in this combat before Andrew Jackson managed to rout the red shirts out to sea, right? Now, in something that I think John Kennedy Toole would have thought hilarious, when this battle took place, when the Battle of New Orleans took place, the War of 1812 was already over, but no one had managed to get a message to any of the combatants. So it had been over for like 2 or 3 weeks at this time, right? And there's still, the message, it was 1815. The message just hadn't gotten to anybody yet. Which it's this misunderstanding, right? However, the great grandfather, Jean-Francois, because of his bravery and chivalry and all of this, is given basically a lifelong pension. And he's given I think he's also given some property, and there's a sort of an economic boom that happens following the War of 1812, of which he is sort of a major beneficiary. He builds a house in this part of New Orleans called Faubourg Marigny. People who are familiar with New Orleans might know where that is. It still exists. And Thelma, John Kennedy Toole's mother, was born in the very same house that this Jean-Francois guy built. So John Kennedy Toole is as native son of a native son. I mean, he's woven into the history of New Orleans, right? And this is relevant because, it's probably a little less like this all of the time, but New Orleans, I don't think we can stress this enough. New Orleans is as close to a foreign country as you can get in America.
Yes.
It's not quite like that now, I'm sure, as much as it was, but you can imagine in 1815, certainly, and that was still somewhat there by the time that John Kennedy Toole, it's sort of fading by the time that John Kennedy Toole comes around in 1937. Certainly Thelma grew up in a New Orleans that would seem more like somewhere in France than it seems like America. Now, there's a little bit we need to kind of throw in there because John Kennedy Toole, despite this de Coing name and this most reputable ancestor being a Frenchman, John Kennedy Toole is actually mostly Irish. He's Irish.
All right.
Yeah. So he's got a little bit of that gift of gab along with the New Orleans thing. Apparently, I didn't know this. Apparently, there's quite a few Irish people in New Orleans.
There are Irish people everywhere in this rotten country, this rotten land. All right,
geez, calm it down, Kevin.
I'll edit that out.
Someone had to win the Civil War for the North, so
that's right.
Yes,
the Ringers.
That's right.
Well, I think
Lincoln's Ringers.
Lincoln's Ringers.
Yeah,
.com. Yeah. I think we got plenty of Irish between the three of us.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So de Coing. So now, Thelma's Irish comes from the more sort of reputable side. John Kennedy Toole's father's side, which is all Irish, comes in a later wave of immigration. So even though there's a lot of Irish on both sides of the family, there's this split between what Thelma would call the Shanty Irish, which was the Toole side, and the Lace Irish, which was her side, right? So she never really liked the Toole side of the family. And she was big on she's kind of almost a cartoon character. She was very big on, being very refined and upstanding, and she would wear gloves when she went out, and gloves and a little hat. Even into her 80s, she would dress like this. And she started out, and she would roll her R's throughout her life, and it was kind of, at some point, I think people made the claim that she's doing that on purpose. That's not that's not necessarily her natural voice, this rolling of the R's thing. She taught at first in the public school system, but at this time, when you got married, if you were a woman and you got married, they wouldn't, the husband, was expected to support the household. you basically weren't given a job as a teacher, or you were kicked out, laid off, or whatever, to make room for single women. So she had taught for a while, then she got married, and then she got the boot. And from then on, she wouldn't really have any stable sources of income, but she would be a tutor. So she would teach violin, and she would teach piano, and she would teach something she called dramatic expression. It was like going around trying to do like tutor people in like finishing school kind of stuff, right? This is
fair to say she was putting on airs.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I think that's what
that's
they call
her whole
that.
her whole bag was putting on airs, right? A little bit about we're going to get back to his mom, because she's definitely the second character in this. She's the antagonist somewhat, and the second most interesting person in the story. But quickly about his father, John Kennedy Toole's father, John Sr., John Dewey Toole. He was a neighbor of Thelma's growing up, kind of the wrong side of the channel. He was what they called Channel Irish, because he was part of his family was part of the second wave of immigration. So they were sort of on the slummier side of town, though it was not far away. He was a pretty handsome guy. There's a picture of him in this biography, which I'm getting most of this information from by
you telling me that people have been bigoted about their neighbors historically throughout history?
It's like, you moved from the same country we did 15 years later. You're barely human.
You shanty.
You
live in your Irish. Shanty. Yeah, we live in a double wide shanty. So, so I'm pulling most of my information from this biography by Renee Paul Nevels and Deborah George Hardy, called Ignatius Rising. It's pretty good. It's a little bit controversial. There's another biography I'm going to pull some stuff from, called Butterflies in the Typewriter by Colin McLaughlin. This one is a slightly controversial, but I think there's a lot of good excerpts from letters and things in here, and I think the basic information is good. So anyway, there's a picture of John Kennedy Toole's father in it. He's a pretty handsome guy. He won the state debate. He was the state debate champion, like his senior year of high school, and he went on to become a car salesman, in the 20s, pretty early in the, cars were kind of new, and he had a car before all of his neighbors because he was a car dealer. So there's a little bit of class attached to that, even if they weren't particularly wealthy.
Sure. So that's like being a computer salesman in the 80s, kind of.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah. Right. Have you heard of this thing, the internet? Yeah, it's going to change the world.
Yep, absolutely. Right. Now, here's one thing I'm going to just put this here, and then it's going to come back later. For a while, when John Sr. and Thelma got married, for a while, they lived with John Sr.'s brother. But he was so eccentric that they had to move out. He stank.
In this family.
Yeah, in this family. Yes, he stank. He said weird things. He apparently bathed in hot milk. And just after a while, they were like, we can't do this. And after they moved,
let's get this guy in the pod.
Yeah, I know, right? I wish he was still around. I'm sure he has some interesting ideas, right?
Yeah, really.
Yeah. So Thelma used this experience with John Sr.'s brother for the rest of their life as like a wedge, and like to maintain her air of superiority. Her family was always the better family, right? And they were frequently distancing from the Toole side of the family. And they got married in 1926. John Jr., John Kennedy Toole, wasn't born until 1937, almost a decade later, and he's an only child. There's some indication that they didn't even want children, or Thelma at least didn't even want children. He comes kind of late. She's 36 years old or so at this point. They are a nominally a Catholic family as well.
I was going to say they're not doing their job for the Lord.
Right.
Oh,
yeah. They were sort of on Easter Catholics, but nonetheless, it's a little unusual for the context, right?
Once again, the Reformation. That's why I don't have any siblings, this kind of thing.
Right.
Dan, you have something to say?
Any sense why they waited so long? Was it an accident? Were they trying not to?
I think they didn't want to. There's sort of anecdotal evidence that Thelma didn't want children.
I see. So maybe this was in fact he John Kennedy Toole was perhaps an accident.
I think he probably was an accident. That seems to make the most sense to me. You get married pretty young, and they were doing it through the late 20s up until the Depression. They were doing well. Like when they got married, John Sr. was a pretty successful guy. There's no reason why they couldn't have had children. They had a big family around, it doesn't really make any sense except one of them, didn't want to, or health reasons or something. But as soon as John Kennedy Toole is born, she goes into full-on devouring mother mode. She's, it brings out all of the latent narcissisms and weirdnesses that she has, and they all get foisted onto poor John Jr. Early on, this manifested in she wanted to raise him to be a perfect Southern gentleman, and not only a perfect Southern gentleman, but a perfect New Orleans gentleman, and not only a perfect New Orleans gentleman, a perfect uptown gentleman, which is a specific type. It's a specific area of in lineage of how you act, how you dress, how you attend parties. When he was a child, he had engraved calling cards that he would, leave with people. And he was, at his mother's urging, he was always giving little gifts to his teachers and things like that, right? There's a picture in this biography of him dressed up at 3 years old in in a white little drummer boy outfit to go to a Mardi Gras party. So he was she was trying to mold him into this perfect New Orleans gentleman, trying to get him a good education. She ideally would have put him into Catholic schools, but she didn't do that because she didn't want all of her money going to the Vatican. There's something weird there that isn't fully understood what her problem was, but
interesting. Yeah, because she is a Catholic, obviously.
On paper she's a Catholic, right? So
it's a big church.
It's true. It's true. So now, on top of this, wanting John to be a star, mothering him, putting all this attention on him being the only child of older parents, she wanted John Kennedy Toole to be a star. She was like a proto stage mother, the way that we think about them now. And remember, she loved to teach violin and the dramatic expression, right? She rolled her R's. And so he was almost like a theatrical project for her when he was a child, which is of course great for every little boy. Let me give you a little reading. This is the first thing I'm going to read from this biography about Thelma and the whole theater thing. She is such a trip. I can hardly believe she's
a tiger mom.
Yeah, she really is.
Le tigre, mom.
Exactly.
Hey, listen, and New Orleans, fantastic town.
Oh, yeah.
You've never been.
Love it.
Yeah, get there. Go for Halloween. That is a cool. And go cool when the Saints are playing. Fun.
That sounds
cool.
Go
eat your way through New Orleans.
Oh, the food is fantastic. Yeah. All right. So here's just a little bit about Ken, and I'm going to call him Ken Toole throughout. From the time Kenny could talk, he was encouraged to perform. Alert, intelligent, and verbally precocious, he came alive in front of an audience, whether they were family, friends, or a group of complete strangers. Like his father, who had a repertoire of hysterically funny voices, Kenny was a natural mimic. People would say this about him throughout his life. He could imitate anybody. They were both rare individuals who could reproduce at will any accent or variety of sound effects. Add to that Kenny's natural acting ability and the encouragement of a trained live-in coach, his mom, and one can understand why at an early age he seemed headed for a life on the stage. So this is from his very earliest days, right? She's encouraging this, but again, she also wants him to do something that's going to make the family name respectable. In her mind, she's still a Decoing, that she's got that Jean-Francois Decoing. We are a respectable New Orleans family. And, you're going to be a part of that tradition. Your father's a bum and a piece of crap, but you are going to elevate our family back to kind of where we belong. Now this is the thing. He is very intelligent. He's very precocious. He's a December baby, so he's right on the edge. And she gets him to skip a grade. And there's a kind of a funny little story about the process of that. So let me just read this real quick. Let's see. A determined Thelma. This is again from the what is it? Neville's and Hardy biography, Ignatius Rising. A determined Thelma went back to the school board to have Kenny evaluated for promotion. He's going to skip a grade. This time he was given a Stanford Binet IQ test by a psychologist employed by the school board. As few records were kept during World War II due to a paper shortage, and because Kenny's cumulative folder did not survive water damage to the storage room at 48 High School, there was no verification of the test results. A score of 130 would be enough today to have a child classified as, quote, gifted, but it wasn't extremely high and not at all on a genius level. Though Thelma returned to McDonough waving a paper stating that her child had a genius score of 133. In later years, Thelma would defend the fact that her son's score wasn't higher by saying he refused to cooperate with the tester, and she reported that she, Principal Elizabeth Danner, and Kenny's first grade teacher had a Class A shouting match right in the hall of the school. Mrs. Ruhlman said that there was indeed some sort of argument about Kenny leaving Miss Langtry's class, but despite this unpleasant incident, Kenny did skip into second grade. Thelma loved to use this word genius to describe Toole. She, after his death, when she was being interviewed about him, she would say, "And oh, my genius! Oh, what did my genius do next? My genius who wrote this book." She was always, that was one of her favorite terms to apply to him, right? Which is kind of a lot of pressure to put on a little kid. You know what I mean? You're a genius. You're going to do incredible things, right? Now, this star thing, him being a star thing, doesn't last forever, as you can imagine. Him being the little star, she starts up a troupe of players, about up to 50 children. It's kind of insane, this community theater thing with all children of all ages, and they go and they play at like convalescent homes, social clubs and stuff like that. They go on and put performances on, and she thrusts Kenny into the front of these things. Kenny, they're formed around Kenny. They're for Kenny to be the main thing, right? But by the time he hits 13, 13 is this sort of hormonal stage where you're early teenager and you don't want to really do anything that your parents say. He has his own sort of rebellion, and he starts showing up being very solemn, starts pushing back, not wanting to participate in these events. And this is the start of a sort of a fissure between him and his mom, because his mother has built this whole thing around him, this whole community theater thing around Kenny, and Kenny doesn't want to do it anymore. He gets kind of depressed. I mean, and you have to imagine too, he's being thrust at the front of this group, but by the time he's 13, he's 5'10". He's kind of overweight. He's awkward and kind of, gangly, though overweight, like any 13-year-old are. Their bodies are still kind of coming into the shape that they're going to be. And he's got to sing these like cheesy old-timey songs. Right? He doesn't want to do that.
What year are we in around here?
This would be 1950.
Okay, so the war's ended.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
So we'll talk a little bit about adolescence, sort of high school time period. He, in high school, partially based on this theater thing, this is where he starts becoming an expert at compartmentalizing his life. He's got the life with his mom. He'll have a life with this friend over here, a life with that friend over here. The friends don't come home because his mother is embarrassing. And he would do this sort of throughout his life. I mean, there's one point much, much later where he starts hanging out with some New Orleans musicians, and he would kind of just show up when they're having a show and hang out and drink beer with them afterwards, maybe help them carry gear out to their van or whatever. And they later would say that they didn't know he was a writer, that they didn't know he was in college. Like, they'd known him for years. They knew him hang out with him every week or two, and they didn't know anything about his life. And this is the kind of thing he was good at doing, was keeping discreet.
This is the way it should be. I love it.
There's nothing wrong with it.
I don't want you to know I'm a podcaster. Right. Let's not talk about it. Some of the greatest, I'm being jokey there, but truly, some of the greatest artists, it's just like, no, I don't, it's like Bacon, Francis Bacon. I don't want to talk about it. Painting.
Right.
Of course he would in the right context, but like when he, anyway. Yeah.
Also, this is another one of the instances where it anticipated modern times, his life, in that in this day and age with all these Anon profiles and stuff, I have my internet friends.
Mm-hmm.
I have my IRL friends who know about my podcast. I have my IRL friends who, if they did know about my podcast, I would, lose them. So,
right.
yeah,
you can't see me right now, but I'm pawing my internet friends through the camera like a lonely cat.
Well, I'm here.
Oh God! Oh.
I'm here, Kevin.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, but no, that's a really good observation. It's very true. It's we have become sort of fragmented, and it's in some sense it's fine. I think for Ken, it in his own life kind of presages his later on. Well, we're going to get to it, but I think this thing that he had broken his life into these various different pieces made it hard for him to hang on to who he was later on. And as he comes towards the end, you have all these different pieces and you kind of put them together and you're like, oh, they don't actually add up to a whole life somehow, right? And so I think we're going to see that. But early on in high school, he was a popular guy. Like, he had friends. He was funny. He wrote in the school paper. I don't know if he was quite a class clown, but many people speak really highly of him. He had quote unquote girlfriends, though they were very chaste relationships. We're going to talk some more about what may or may not have been going on there later. But he, up until this point, up to high school, he's a bit of an overachiever. He's a year ahead, but he's physically big enough that it doesn't seem odd. If you're a small kid and you're a year ahead, maybe you kind of stick out. He wasn't that. He had a high school, had this column that was apparently very popular. It was like a gossip column that he would use to sarcastically knock his enemies, quote unquote.
What are we talking about on the After Dark again?
We're going to talk about whether or not John Kennedy Toole was a homosexual.
And you're telling me he had a gossip column in high school?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm just trying
Kevin, don't ruin the After Dark.
I know the pieces fit. Go on.
Now, here's something else that he's doing during high school. And this is another example of compartmentalization. Nobody knew about this. He was writing his first novel called The Neon Bible. I'm going to kick it to Dan to kind of tell us a little bit about The Neon Bible.
Let me interject real quick. That is a cool title.
It's a great title. It's the title of an album by they stole it. They took it from him. Who is it? Anyway,
I'll look it up.
Yeah, it is a great name. It's a great title.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I love the title. I mean, perhaps seconded only by A Confederacy of Dunces.
Yeah.
But no.
Arcade
Excellent
Fire.
title. And so the Neon Bible, as I started reading it in preparation for this podcast, I actually had not read it before. And I was struck by, as would be normal if you write something in high school and then you write something that which is a more considered adult effort like Confederacy of Dunces, you will see a dramatic change in the style of writing, in the ability, frankly, and that is present here in the Neon Bible. His skills are not quite as sharp. His grasp of the material is not quite as his grasp of the human experience perhaps is not quite as strong, and that does shine through. But what also shines through is that by any other standard, this is a very good novel. This is certainly much better than a lot of the novels that are produced and published today.
He's 16 years
16.
old. Yeah.
So this is really quite good. It's hard to say exactly how biographical it is or how autobiographical, but it's about a young boy and his struggling family in a small town. His father loses his job. They have to move out of the town into the hills. They are kind of outsiders. The townspeople look down on the people in the hills, and that is kind of the dynamic that is at play there. And so there's a lot of interesting insights into the Neon Bible, and it gives us a lot of insights into the character the adolescent mind and motivations and values of John Kennedy Toole. And so I think it would be fair to say that in this novel, certainly um, John Kennedy Toole perceives the protagonist as an outsider. And indeed, Ignatius also obviously is an outsider. Yeah. And I think, as the episode will show, Toole probably thought of himself as an outsider as well.
I think that's fair. I think it's interesting with him because I think it was a sort of he kind of destined himself to it, as I think we'll see. It was like he couldn't, he wasn't an outsider because people pushed him out. He was an outsider because he wasn't willing to go in, if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, that seems clear, and even clear in ways that are not spelled out, but a close read of Dunces to me would demonstrate that. But to return to Neon Bible, he it's interesting because the character of Ignatius is he is a monarchist. He wants to have a kind of a Catholic integralist society. He is very highly moralistic, and so obviously there's a lot of scholarship and criticism of to what extent is this a parody? To what extent is this are these Toole's own views? And I think that's hard to say exactly. That's hard to, and we'll probably discuss it, but it's hard to kind of unwind where Toole's views begin, where Ignatius's views begin. But to the extent to which the Neon Bible offers perhaps a through line into his adolescent, beliefs, morality, values, he kind of chafes at the conservative Southern society of his day. There's a character named Aunt May, who is the aunt of the protagonist in Neon Bible, who was a former showgirl, and she, for that reason, is an outcast in the town. But the protagonist, the child, who perhaps was a stand-in for Toole, he felt great attachment and sympathy for Aunt May, and in a sense for the way in which in that era women of her station and life choices, what have you, were ill-treated or used up by society. And so that in a sense, that in that period of time, that kind of sympathy for the Aunt May character, that indeed the protagonist of Neon Bible has some level of clearly he believes that the attitudes of the conservative South concerning race and a few other areas, issues are close-minded, shall we say. And that makes him an outsider during that era. And I wonder to what extent he also in Dunces expresses clear kind of derision for the pieties of the bohemian kind of social, what today would be like the social justice class. So he clearly has it's clear that it's unclear where Toole's politics lie.
We're gonna see that. No, that's great. That's interesting that's showing up in the Neon Bible, because I think we're gonna see that in the South. He's a little more, whatever the term is. He is sort of chafing at some of the old conventions. But later, when he lives up north in New York City for a while. He gets up there, and it's like, whoa, this is a little bit much. So he's sort of an outsider in both places. Coming from different directions.
I think a lot of people have that experience, especially now where people transplant a lot more. You think, well, I'm a bit liberal, and then you move to San Francisco, and you're like, nope.
Interesting. So I don't know. Is there anything else about Neon Bible we want to say, or
should I read one of the passages?
Yeah, if you got that passage,
Right,
that'd be great.
All right. So this is, and we just listened earlier to a passage from Dunces. Now I think that if we're paying attention, the prose will sound somewhat different here. Still good, but not quite as I suppose not quite as in some respects sophisticated or developed, but in any case, not bad by many standards. So here we go. But I knew the way the people in town thought about things. They always had some time left over from their life to bother about other people and what they did. They thought they had to get together to help other people out. Like the time they got together about the woman who let a colored man borrow her car and told her the best place for her was up north with the other N-word lovers. And the time they got the veterans with overseas wives out. If you were different from anybody in town, you had to get out. That's why everyone was so much alike. The way they talked, what they did, what they liked, what they hated. If somebody got to hate something and he was the right person, everybody had to hate it too. Or people began to hate the ones who didn't hate it. They used to tell us in school to think for yourself, but you couldn't do that in town. You had to think what your father thought all his life. And that was what everybody thought.
It's remarkably sophisticated for a 16-year-old.
16 years
Absolutely,
old.
Yeah. That was my takeaway. Sophisticated morally, but also like very good writing for a 16-year-old.
It is, and it's coming from a similar, like, it's not a just screw you, dad. Like there is like a little bit of a rebellion kind of, but it's not. It's somewhat focused and observant, actually, rather than generalized.
There's a profound sadness in that passage too. It's very sad.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, because you can hear him saying at some point they're going to kick me out too. Right.
Or
at some point I'm going to be the one that's got to leave or something.
Yeah. And anybody who's grown up in a town like that immediately recognizes it. It's a very difficult thing to articulate, but it's real. Whole cultures are like that.
Yeah.
Sort of fatalism.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And conformism and just,
Yeah. So we'll move on. We'll talk. I mean, that's kind of closes out. That's the sort of the high school version. Now he graduates early too. He's I think 16 years old actually when he graduates. And he's written this. He's written this book. He sends Neon Bible off to a couple publishers. Nothing comes from it. He sort of just puts it on a shelf and it's never mentioned again. Nobody really knew about this book until well after he died. Nobody even knew it existed until somebody was kind of going through his archives. He ends up getting, he did well in high school and he ends up getting a scholarship to Tulane, so in New Orleans, to which Thelma, of course, said that he was a genius. His initial plan was to get a degree in engineering of all things. And that went out the window pretty much right away because he kind of knew that English literature was going to be his thing. I think the engineering thing came from, his father had been at least moderately successful, but it was kind of a dwindling thing. They weren't doing that well economically anymore. And the high points of the Toole family's finances probably came when John was a little boy. So by the time he's in college, it's starting to look like, well, when am I going to have to take care of mom and dad? Like that's not quite there yet, but it's looming, right? And it will become an issue later. He does really well at Tulane. He's on the dean's list. He gets involved in the school newspaper, writing book reviews and articles, actually cartoons as well. He contributes cartoons to the Tulane school newspaper. There are a couple little predilections that I want to just make sure we capture about him that kind of developed during this time. One is an obsession with Marilyn Monroe. So, After Dark, we might think about this a little bit more.
Yeah. There was just a little movie that came out that caused a little bit of a stir about Maryland. Yeah, Maryland. Yeah. Blonde.
So
people were talking about that movie.
I have not
we
seen
are
it
gonna
yet.
we are gonna do Maryland. Maryland is big air. Anybody who has millions of posters on walls is big air.
Well, she's definitely an interesting figure. I mean, we're still trying to figure out what she meant, for sure.
Indeed.
So he thought of her, he idolized her. He thought of her as the most, beautiful, sensual, vulnerable. She was almost like to him, she almost seemed like, and he, I don't think he thought of this in a disrespectful way. She was almost like an alien to him. He was almost like, I can't understand how a human being can be this. That he was that sort of enamored with her. He even actually wrote a letter to a New York Times journalist who'd written an article about her, saying how much he liked the article and how fair it had been. Right. So like
he's simping the journalists who are simping for Maryland.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, he's a simp's simp.
Simp. Yeah, double simp.
Yeah, that's tough. That one's tough for me.
So he's also becoming, he's also developing this humor, right? We said in high school, popular, he can mimic people, he can tell stories. This is just getting more and more, obviously, as he's getting older, getting more and more refined. So by the time he's in college, there's friends remembering him saying, this is a quote from a friend of his, he's a wonderful wit and a very good storyteller, but there was always a sort of brittle quality to his humor. There's always a little bit of an edge to it, something, not quite happy-go-lucky, always. He also had a little bit of a thing where the stories he told, though charming, tended to how oftentimes people who are very funny will oftentimes, and they're good storytellers, they'll often tell a story that's somewhat self-deprecating, right? It's a story about how they got into a situation that was like, look how dumb, this is this dumb thing I did yesterday, right? And his stories tended to be about, look at this really smart thing that I did, right? It's sort of like with this, I did this thing and I was so perceptive and I don't think it necessarily, according to his friends that are discussed in his biography, I don't know the alienated people, but I think it was kind of indicative of only child, told by his mother how brilliant he was, under the pressures of kind of trying to live up to that, but didn't have the knockaround situation that you have with maybe an older sibling where you kind of get put into check a little bit, or even the competitive nature of having a younger sibling. It's a little bit of an older child thing potentially for some people, not always. And I think it is, you do see a little bit of the Thelma DeCoing influence, kind of the what are now slight pathologies that might grow into bigger pathologies. You kind of see them spurting out.
So an early practitioner of the humble brag.
Yes, yeah, exactly, for sure. No, that was, I think, definitely in college time. That was definitely John Kennedy Toole. He also developed a deep and abiding and lifelong love for booze during college. Particularly liquor. I mean,
Dan just refilled his drink.
Yeah.
We got 3 writers on the pod talking about a drunk writer.
Right.
Well, on my way.
Yeah. So no surprise there. He would, and the thing is, in the biography, it doesn't seem like it was, we're not talking about a raging alcoholic. I think we're talking about, I don't know. It seems like, Kevin, I know you've been to New Orleans. I don't know, Dan, if you've been down there.
Yeah.
It's just a heavy drinking town.
Oh, yes.
I think,
every weekend, just craziness.
It's So I think it was some of that too. Plus, he's in college in New Orleans, so of course he's.
Well, it's very hot down there, and you have to have. It's tactical alcoholism.
Yes. He also dabbled a little bit in Benzodrex, which a lot of people in the 50s did. This is the Benzodrine is the secret ingredient to the entire beat literature movement. So this is not uncommon that people were, there are these little amphetamine derivative inhaler things. That doesn't seem to have been a problem, but it is kind of interesting because there are a couple points where John Kennedy Toole does mostly seem like he's living in his own cultural bubble, But then you do see moments where he kind of bumps up against what else is going on in the rest of the world, and I think this is kind of one of them. Something else he's doing in college is he's becoming intimately familiar with every nook and cranny of New Orleans. He thought he loved New Orleans, kind of, he loved it. He probably had slight love-hate relationship with it. Most importantly, he thought it was hilarious. Everything about New Orleans cracked him up. Right.
I love that.
Yeah. And he would talk, even then he was talking about in college, it's not clear he was working on it, but he would tell people sometimes, he's like, one day I'm going to write a novel that really explains this whole Latin madness that's going on in this city.
Yeah. I mean, I think Dunces really, and people have said it before me, of course, is a love letter to New Orleans.
It is with kind of warts and all too. He's trying to show it. And I think we might talk about it a little bit later. After publication, there was some resistance. I mean, I think some New Orleans people took it kind of personally, but it was ultimately embraced, and there's a statue of John Kennedy Toole down there and murals of him. And ultimately it's seen as this like, put New Orleans on the map kind of thing, which clearly was already on the map. But there's a sort of a mutual appreciation, I think, has ultimately developed between the book and the city.
That's interesting because it's probably the biggest thing after Streetcar for that town.
I would say letters in the sort of post-war. Well, I don't know. I guess I don't know. Remember when Streetcar was written? But yeah. For sure. Yeah. After Tulane, he goes to, and he's young, right? Because he graduated early. So I think he was only at Tulane for 3 years. Because 1958, he's 21. Actually, he wouldn't even be 21 yet. He'd be 20, becoming 21 at the end of 1958. He gets awarded a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship to study for his master's degree at Columbia. And so he meets
everybody's favorite president, good old Woody Wilson. Not controversial at all. At Columbia,
that guy.
At Columbia,
yeah, love it. Love the Federal
Heard
Reserve.
about that school.
I don't know a little bit about it.
Yeah, Columbia. That's in New York, right?
Somewhere in New York. Yeah.
I think that's where the Ghostbusters went.
Exactly.
Yeah. Who would stack books like this? He this is one thing I want to convey is, and I didn't realize this. I mean, I knew he was gifted. Obviously, if you write Confederacy of Dunces, you're a talented person. But my conception of him, and something I like about doing this about the show, is I realize I have these preconceived notions about these people, like John Kennedy Toole, without really knowing that much about him. And I thought of him basically as Ignatius Riley. That was kind of who he was.
Yeah, I think most people do think that way about him.
Yeah,
and are surprised to learn that he's only partially Ignatius.
Right. Yeah, and so you learn this thing, and you're like, well, he's like kind of like a prodigy. I mean, he takes a course load at Columbia that gets him a master's degree in a year. So he has a master's degree from Columbia in English literature before he turns, well, let's see, he would be 21 when he gets it, right?
It's pretty heavy.
It's a pretty big deal. He finishes his master's in a year. Now, I thought it was interesting what he actually wrote his thesis on, because it was somebody I'd never heard of before. He wrote his thesis on this writer named John Lyly, or Lilly, Lyly. Somebody I'd never, weirdly enough, had never even heard of.
Nor have I.
Yeah. So I looked into it. I was like, well, okay, who's this guy, and can it tell us anything about Confederacy of Dunces, or anything? So I'm going to just read a little bit from Wikipedia, because it is actually pretty interesting. John Lilly, born 1553, died 1606, was an English writer, dramatist, courtier, and parliamentarian. He was best known during his lifetime for 2 books, one called Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit, and the sequel, Euphues and His England, in 1580. Excuse me. But is perhaps best remembered now for his plays. Lilly's distinctive and much imitated literary style, named after the title character of his two books, is known as a Euphuism. Okay, now what is a Euphuism? Euphuism is a peculiar mannered style of English prose. Okay, so it takes his name from this John Lilly guy. It consists of a precociously ornate and sophisticated style, employing a deliberate excess of literary devices, basically for the purposes of humor, right? So I'm going to give you just an example from John Lilly of what a euphuism. It is virtue, yea, virtue, gentlemen, that maketh gentlemen, that maketh the poor rich, the base-born noble, the subject a sovereign, the deformed beautiful, the sick whole, the weak strong, the most miserable happy. There are two principal and peculiar gifts in the nature of man, knowledge and reason. The one commandeth, and the other obeyeth. These things neither the whirling wheel of fortune can change, neither the deceitful cavillings of worldlings separate, neither sickness abate, neither age abolish. And apparently this was the height of humor in 1580.
Oh, man.
But what I do think is
it's still better than Nanette.
Well, okay, fair enough. What I do think is interesting, whereas I don't think it's that funny to us now, because we can't necessarily distinguish that from what we expect of 1580s writing. But if you kind of pair it with this description of what he's doing, this euphuism, right? He's stacking all these literary devices on in a repetitive manner, almost to make fun of pseudo sophistication, which is sort of what Toole does, right?
Yeah. I mean, in the character of Ignatius, like clearly his practiced erudition is, and I mean that is something that in Nutcracker I definitely kicked up into high gear.
Yeah.
Where like you grow tired of the main character's pretensions to the point where you just want to throttle this guy.
Right.
I also love that it's called Nutcracker. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's just for our listeners, Nutcracker is the name of a pornographic website where the main character Spencer Grunhauer writes his treatise critiquing modernity in the comments section of this pornography website, Nutcracker.
Right, because he gets banned off of the other platforms.
Yeah,
right?
he gets banned off of what is essentially 4chan or 4chan, and the only platform left to him is this porn site.
Oh man, I remember reading it.
It's so funny.
As I was coming, I was like, why is this thing called Nutcracker? Like everything else made sense. I was like, I love this book, but I'm 30 pages in or whatever. Why is this book called Nutcracker?
and then
when it happens, oh man, yeah. I can't say enough. I'm serious. I can't say enough good things.
Coming out soon. Make sure you follow Dan on the Bird website. It's Baltic _Dan. Is that right, Dan?
That's right. Baltic _Dan on Nutcracker. Spencer, his followers are called his nut buddies. So you can follow me on Twitter and be my nut buddy.
Oh wait, is there a Spencer Grunhauer Twitter account?
Not yet. Not yet. There should be. Maybe I will in conjunction with its actual release.
Very good idea.
You didn't even have to write anything new. You just dropped.
Yeah, no, I really just could. I honestly,
you already did all the work to make that a banger Twitter account. So
no, I just did an Ignatius quote on Twitter before we came on, and it already has a bunch of likes. I don't know if people even know that it's Toole, but
that's awesome. Yeah. But that's So I was really interested in this. I almost wanted to dig into deep with this John Lilly thing, because it's like, okay, so somehow Toole picks up this John Lilly character who the three of us who are fairly well educated in the world of letters, none of us have even heard of this guy. Toole somehow picks him out of total obscurity and it appears to me to be actually significantly influenced from it. Maybe not by the line by line writing, but at least this concept of how you can arrive at a kind of dramatic irony humor, right? You can make something, if you make something overly sophisticated, it becomes hilarious somehow. I love it.
Yeah. It does.
Yeah. So a couple other things in New York, just talking about, because John Kennedy Toole in New York is to me an interesting picture. We talk about this guy who's on one hand a very serious student, but on the other hand is a little bit of a goofball. I mean, he's a storyteller. He's very funny. He's apparently an incredible dancer of all things. Grew up. He's like a grown up theater kid in some ways. But he's from the South, and you plug him into New York in the late 50s. Early 60s. And And I just have a little bit I want to read from this bio about this.
Can I ask, do we have any idea where he was living in New York? Was he living near Columbia or in Harlem? Or I wonder.
Know at this time where he was living, actually. Later on, he goes back, and I know he's living like right next to Hunter College.
Okay.
Which I don't know if anybody knows where that is. My New York geography is not that good. Oh, you do? Okay.
I'm a New Yorker here.
Okay, all right.
I will go that far.
All right. Yeah, well, that narrows it down to about 6 million people or whatever.
I'm one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so here's a bit. He met a girl in New York who was from New Orleans. He would always do this when he was in New York and he spent a fair amount of time there. He would always hang around other people from New Orleans. That was his favorite people to spend time with, right? It's expats. Again, New Orleans is sort of a foreign country. This is like an American going to, Japan to teach English and hanging out with other Americans. Since Ken, this is from the Neville and Hardy biography again. Since Ken loved to dance, one of his favorite places was the Roseland Ballroom. Ken and Ruth would dance all night for $2. This was something that the couple did alone. The big band sound was outdated to most young people in those days when Buddy Holly was topping the charts, but Ken and Ruth loved the live orchestra at the old dance palace. As the youngest and liveliest couple on the floor, they attracted a great deal of flattering attention. They would dance until the place closed, fueled only by soft drinks since no liquor was allowed. Ken and Ruth kept steady company that year and were fond of each other. The story of their relationship has always been a confusing one, and this is partially due to Kathman herself. So, make a point here. This is going to talk about more in the After Dark. Interesting that he's going on, like every weekend, he's going dancing till the wee hours of the morning with this woman, and it never becomes physically intimate whatsoever. That seems almost impossible to me.
I mean, clearly he has not read Heartiste.
Yeah.
He is not familiar with the game.
Yeah.
But
right. Yeah. So
that was a later development in our culture.
Yeah, that came. He didn't see that one coming, right? Yeah, very interesting. He gets this degree from Columbia. Again, impressively, 21 years old, master's degree from Columbia. That's that's a real accomplishment as far as I'm concerned. He moves back to Louisiana, and he gets a job at what at the time is called Southwestern Louisiana Institute. It would eventually be turned into the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. So he's not quite in New Orleans, he's in Lafayette, which is, it's driving distance, obviously, but it's not quite New Orleans. And I think this was actually really good for Ken. This has been called by some people the year he taught there. This is maybe the best year of Ken's life. I think it was perfect for him geographically because he was in Louisiana, so he's comfortable there, but he's far enough away from New Orleans that he doesn't have to deal with Thelma all the time. He's kind of got the best of both worlds, right? And he can kind of create his own environment. Plus, he's this new teacher. He comes into Southwestern Louisiana Institute. Make sure I'm calling it the right thing. Yes, SLI. And he is immediately everybody's favorite. He's this very young guy, very intelligent, fun. He's got that Columbia air, like he's got some prestige, but he's a down home native son at the same time. And he quickly becomes like the favorite teacher at the school, but also like the favorite dinner guest. So the faculty all wants him to come hang out, and the students all love him. Some students described his classes as like, it was basically like a stand-up routine, but I also learned more than I did in all my other classes at the same time. So he's like a master teacher, I would say. And this is coming from, and he teaches for years, and we'll talk more about it. He had a real gift for teaching literature. And one of his friends that he made there was this woman, Pat Rickles. There's this great documentary called The Omega Point, which is an intense name for a documentary about John Kennedy Toole. That's the name of a Don DeLillo.
That's novel, that creepy DeLillo novel that gets under your skin. Interesting.
I'm not even sure why it's called The Omega Point, but it's a pretty good documentary. They interview Pat Rickles, this woman who is his friend, and she's much older because this documentary is made in like the late 90s. And she says, his 1 year there was the most memorable year I had teaching at SLI for decades. Wow. Like there's people who've worked there for 10 years in the same building as I do that I barely remember. And like John Kennedy Toole, before he was famous, before he was the John Kennedy Toole we know, the author of Confederacy of Dunces, made a real impression on people. People genuinely liked him, though there was always this little bit of distance. There's always this, there's one final layer of the John Kennedy Toole onion that nobody ever really felt like they could get through. Yeah.
I mean, hence probably due to his compartmentalization of his personality.
Yeah.
I mean, was there ever anyone who truly knew him? That might be the.
Yeah, I don't think that there was. I really don't. And you live that well. If you live that way long enough, you sort of become probably a little bit alienated from yourself to some degree. You know, I'm putting on this kind of show with these people and this kind of show with these people, and then like there's no place in my life where I settle in and I'm actually me. You know, I can imagine that's a kind of a tricky experience. Now there's somebody that he meets at SLI, another teacher at SLI, and I'm going to read this description of this guy, and I think it's interesting. Yeah. Okay, let me find my spot. Not that page 55. Again, this is from again the Neville's and Hardy biography. Let's see. Okay, such a person, we're talking about somebody he's meeting at SLI. Such a person was Bob Byrne, or Bob B-Y-R.
I think it's Byrne, yeah.
Byrne, yeah. English professor and certified eccentric. Byrne's Aunt May had taught Ken in elementary school, and both men were products of a New Orleans upbringing. In 1960, Byrne fascinated John Kennedy Toole, and according to many colleagues at SLI, he was the inspiration for the character of Ignatius J. Riley in the novel Ken would write. Byrne's area of specialization was the medieval period. He and Ken had many discussions about Boethius and the Wheel of Fortuna. Byrne later contended that Ken liked to talk about these things, but had no deep understanding of them. It was Byrne's personal idiosyncrasies that caused Ken to take special note. Byrne, who was forever talking about theology, geometry, and his rich inner life, played the lute and worried about his weight, which had a tendency to balloon. Byrne had an aversion to driving a car and considered himself a devoted slob wearing baggy clothes in an unruly mix of odd colors. Then there was the hat. Just like Ignatius, Byrne had a deerstalker hat, but in red, not green. Byrne kept the ear flaps up and used the headwear as rain gear, and Ken gave him a bad time about it. Byrne admitted to others that there were some similarities between himself and Ignatius, but took care to point out the differences. The back garden of Byrne's house, although a fantasy landscape of stone lanterns and garden statuary, was neat and well tended, something Ignatius would never have been able to accomplish. So, which is even like an Ignatius type thing to say. Well, he's nothing like me. Have not you seen my statuary? You know, it's like, yeah.
Here, come and I'll play you some lute in my garden.
Could Ignatius play a lute like this? It's like, yeah. So yeah, maybe we can talk maybe more. This is kind of a good spot because again, I think people's conception of Ignatius Riley is that he's John Kennedy Toole and the two are practically the same person. But here we see that at least sort of aesthetically on the surface, he's pulling it from this guy he met and was friends with. So maybe we can talk like, I don't know if you've got a little section here. Maybe we'll talk more about Confederacy of Dunces and Ignatius Riley and
no, I mean, Ignatius, I think there's, obviously a lot of speculation about who Ignatius was based on. Was it based on Toole? Was it based on this guy, Byrne? Was it? And, I think, honestly, we will not really know the answer, but certainly from the way you described it, a guy walking around with like a hunter's cap who is fat and talking about Boethius. Yeah, that sounds a lot like Ignatius J. Riley.
Pretty much him, yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sure he drew a lot of inspiration from this guy, but, also like all writers, when you're writing a character, as much as we are loath to admit it, some of ourselves go into that character. So I'm sure that was also in effect. But I think one of the real distinctions is that Ignatius's character, from what you've described Toole to be, a kind of charming man, good dancer, enigmatic fellow that people like were, wanted to be friends with, liked him seemingly. That is not Ignatius, not at all.
Right.
Like Ignatius is known for being highly combative, prone to domineering harangues and outbursts. And like a great example of this, and this sounds like something that Toole himself would, despite whatever political predilections he had growing up in the conservative South and having certain views on race and what have you. I don't think that Toole himself would have engineered the what Ignatius refers to as the crusade for Moorish dignity, which is Ignatius. He gets hired in his first job in many years to be the some sort of office worker, a clerk, a file clerk in the Levi pants factory or the Levy pants factory. And the factory workers are they are all black, and he, being someone who is a Christian humanist, but also in his own mind in a competition with this woman named Myrna Minkoff, and he wants to show her that he is more committed to the advancement of marginalized peoples than she is, because this is her whole thing, and he wants to show that he's even better at that. He organizes a sort of, not just a strike, but like a storming of the office by the factory workers, which he leads as a demagogue, and in something he calls the Crusade for Moorish Dignity. And of course it blows up in his face, and he gets fired, and it's a marvel he's not arrested. But this clearly is not something that Toole himself would have done. Toole is, seemingly a charming but relatively mild-mannered man, and he is not given to the type of not that he doesn't have kind of perhaps interesting ideas, not that he doesn't have ambitions or what have you, but he has the good sense to refrain from the types of outlandish behavior and outbursts that Ignatius engages in. And maybe Byrne has more of this, but I truly doubt anyone could remain employed by a university acting the way Ignatius acts. So I think a lot of his behavior, a lot of Ignatius's behavior is, and this is true, I think, for many novelists. I'm sure you would agree to some extent, Brad, that you create a character and then you give that character permission to do the things that, well, maybe not necessarily that you want to do, but that your imagination wants the character to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think Ignatius is, maybe one part this Byrne guy, maybe one part drawn from the real life experience of Toole, but also substantially Toole's it.
Right. And I think that's the right way to put it. And also being, it's funny you talk about the crusade for Moorish dignity and trying to one up Myrna particularly. It makes me wonder. I think we're going to see when he goes back to Columbia here in a second. I think he might be making a general parody or comment on activism as it is. Like, is it really about this cause, or is it about some kind of social one-upsman belonging to this thing, virtue signaling sort of thing, right?
Which is, obviously very relevant to today. So, and this was something that my co-host Matt Pegas, in preparing for our episode of Confederacy of Dunces, he read Dunces, and he too was immediately struck by the fact that it so well anticipated the current political moment with stuff like virtue signaling, and you realize that the fights of today, they were being fought in the 1960s. And it's a different playing field today, and perhaps the fights have higher stakes. But nevertheless,
the
these dynamics.
Yeah, the patterns are certainly there. He was definitely he was there to see him, and this is the next thing that happens. So after this year at SLI, he decides he's going to go back to Columbia, and to get his PhD is the idea. While he's at Columbia, this is another thing, because again, I want to hit this note of that John Kennedy Toole is sort of this wonderkind. He gets a position teaching at Hunter College, and at the time, he is the youngest professor that Hunter College has ever hired in 1960, right? So again, and maybe I'm over stressing it, but like he's legit. He's
he's a savant.
He really is, right?
Yeah.
And the kids, the students at Hunter loved him just as much as the students at SLI did. He was quite good at it.
Did he ever meet Tennessee?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
He probably didn't have the level of recognition or fame. Yeah. Tennessee was already.
And Toole's in the academic world much more, and he's not in the showbiz side of literature, right? He's in the academic side of literature for sure. It was this time at Columbia was a little bit different. He felt a little bit more comfortable in New York. He's a little bit older. He's only a year older, but in your early 20s, a year makes a big difference. He's more comfortable in the city. He's he knows people, he knows places, he knows how to get by, things are more expensive. He knows how to budget himself, all of these things. But things are slightly different in even just, a year and some change. I guess it'd be a year and a year and a summer or something like that. And let me read this because this is now, and it ties into the aspect of Confederacy of Dunces, Dan, that you were talking about. This is now, when he was there before, it was one thing, and now we're in 1960s. We're in the cause decade, the decade of the cause, right? And this flavors his experience his second experience at Columbia a little bit differently. So reading again from the Neville's and Hardy biography. In Dalt Wonk's article, Dalt Wonk is this like New Orleans eccentric writer figure. I tried to find this article, I could not. But anyway, in Dalt Wonk's article on Toole, Ken is reported to have said that, quote, every time the elevator door opens at Hunter College, you are confronted by 20 pairs of burning eyes, 20 sets of bangs, and everyone waiting for someone to push a Negro. As a white male from the Deep South, Ken was the most likely subject, which was something he resented. He was dismayed by the liberal brand of narrow-mindedness he discovered in New Orleans. Although New Orleans had always been publicly and politically segregated, there were among its people a tradition of tolerance, both religious and racial. Ken was shocked to find that in an integrated city like New York, there was a large degree of personal intolerance. In particular, he had trouble with the anti-Catholic sentiment of some of the students and faculty. Ken was a Christmas and Easter churchgoer, but he had a cultural commitment to Roman Catholicism. It was as much
the one true faith.
Oh, yeah.
I got to get it in there.
He would have
got to get it in there.
we kind of just, without trying, always pick Catholics.
No,
preponderance among artists.
Yeah, it's not like there's. It's not like there's.
We're not going out of our. This is not a Catholic podcast per se.
It just happens. It just comes up every episode.
Very, very curious. Very interesting.
Yeah. He had a cultural commitment to Roman Catholicism. It was as much a part of him as his fair complexion, and he couldn't understand why he should suffer scorn because of it. Emily Griffin, I think one of his students, once went to observe him teach. Oh, no, it was another professor. Emily Griffin once went to observe him teach and noticed that he had scrawled on the blackboard, quote, anti-Catholicism is the anti-Semitism of the intellectual.
Oh,
this didn't make points with the students. Unfortunately, his arguments with them further undermined his authority as their teacher. So just interesting, right? He's sort of he's pushed back by what he called the liberal narrow-mindedness of New York City. Now, at the same time, I don't want to put him totally in the opposite direction of all of this, because he was also very enthusiastic about the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Partially because Kennedy was a Catholic, but he also seemed to be at least optimistic about what John F. Kennedy might bring to the table as a president. So we can't. It's too simplistic to just say he's anyway, I think you can see kind of where he's sitting, and it's a little bit of an outsider thing, right? Because he's a little bit outside of the South, and he's a little bit outside of New York City when it comes to his sort of politics.
I have to interject here. I did pull up the Wikipedia, and there's a sentence that I want to read. Right,
sure.
He was teaching, or he was studied English at Columbia in New York, while simultaneously teaching at Hunter College. He also taught at various Louisiana colleges, and during his early career as an academic, he was valued on the faculty party circuit for his wit and gift for mimicry. Yeah. The faculty party circuit.
Do they that doesn't exist anymore?
Yeah, doesn't exist anymore. What okay, all right.
Yeah,
I just thought that was funny. Yeah,
isn't that funny? Like there's like every weekend.
Yeah, it's the Rolling Stones.
Oh, I gotta go to
I gotta go hit the faculty party circuit.
Yeah,
it's just a very.
I just assumed that universities during that era, it must have been a great time to be a professor.
Yeah, sure.
I imagine there really was a party circuit, and they're just all chilling. Not that tenure isn't a thing now, and not that professors don't live great lives, but it really
he would different vibe. Yeah,
with this, he would be an adjunct now, right? Like if he came out with a master's degree from Columbia, you wouldn't even get a teaching position, probably.
Bro, he'd be a waiter. He'd be
yeah. Things
he'd be writing Nutcracker and trying to publish it on the internet.
Be podcasting.
Yeah, exactly. Dude. Oh, that's so funny. So, okay. Yeah, man, I just had this whole image of, never mind.
Let it go, Brad. Let it go, Brad.
I'm just gonna let that go. One thing of note in this Columbia time, because we're going to move out. He was not at Columbia this second phase very long. He does room with this guy named Kent Tolliver. It's not spelled Tolliver, but apparently it's pronounced Tolliver. This is going to come up a little bit more in our After Dark when we talk about this question of what is up with John Kennedy Toole's sexuality. But interestingly enough, apparently at this time, Kent Tolliver knew a guy named Clay Shaw, and at some point, either there in New York or in New Orleans, John Kennedy Toole met Clay Shaw. Well, okay, who's Clay Shaw? Clay Shaw is the only person ever put on trial associated with the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Oh, wow.
Clay Shaw was this New Orleans playwright, kind of known gay guy who some conspiracy theorists still believe that he's caught up in it. He was a character in Oliver Stone's
I was about to say that's how I remember. The gay man from JFK.
That's him. And apparently John Kennedy Toole met him at least on one occasion, and he was roommates with a good friend, who knows what all else, of Clay Shaw's when he lived in New York City. So I just think that's interesting. Again, we're seeing Now I said John F. Kennedy, and now I'm not going to be able to stop saying it. John Kennedy Toole. He seems like he's in his own bubble world, but it does brush up against the rest of the world, right? He knows a guy who went to court for possibly assassinating the president, which is it's just kind of an interesting position to be in history.
He got around.
Really did. That New Orleans connection with the Kennedy assassination is pretty real.
Yeah, I don't totally understand it, but Oswald lived there for a time, I believe.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
I think there's a whole section in Libra about that. Yeah,
interesting.
So something's brewing down there. I was hoping that I was going to be able to pull a thread that somehow, After Dark was going to be did John Kennedy Toole kill John F. Kennedy? But
you could, you know what? You could make it happen.
You could say anything you want.
This is the internet. We can say anything. There won't be any consequences for that.
Right. Of course not.
Kanye West has shown us the way.
I would show up tomorrow and be like, I can't, my debit card. How do my debit card's not working?
Well, this we can say, I think. We're not going to lose our bank accounts for this one.
No, I don't think so.
Right. The Vatican's not going to shut down our PayPal account. Not yet. You wait for it. Wait for Christo-fascism is coming to America by way of the church.
Oh,
by way of John Kennedy Toole.
That's right. That's right. And his valve.
So John Kennedy Toole, Columbia, teaching at Hunter College. He gets his first year in, and then in the spring of 1961, he's enjoying himself now. He's kind of settling into New York, and it looks like he's going to get his PhD from Columbia, which part of the reason he wants to do this is he wants to increase his earnings potential, get a better teaching position. The teaching position down at SLI was good and he enjoyed it, but there was bigger and better things, and he had the talent for it, right? Also, as I said earlier, he's starting to be somewhat concerned about having to take care of his parents. So there's this kind of pressing, it's still somewhat in the future, but he knows that he's eventually got to make more money. Plus, he's interested in it, right? So he's going to pursue this thing. And then in 1961, Uncle Sam comes calling and he's drafted into the Army. Now, I read this and I was like, wait, 1961, a guy in a PhD program gets drafted into the, like, it didn't make any sense to me at first. And apparently this is a blind spot in my historical knowledge. Apparently between the end of World War II and I think 1973, when the draft closed after Vietnam, the draft was open the whole time. And what they would do is they weren't drafting, there was still a volunteer component in the Army. So you weren't drafting infantrymen. You were drafting for positions that you needed to fill. And one of these positions they needed to fill, of all things, was an English teacher. So you get this Columbia grad to do it, which to me seems a little, I feels like you could just draft, like, I don't know. It seems odd to me that this happened, but it did happen. John Kennedy Toole, he ends up getting stationed at Fort Buchanan in Puerto Rico, of all places. Mostly because he did know Spanish. And I don't know, it's just kind of an interesting thing. You're studying at Columbia, there's not wartime, and all of a sudden you get a letter that's like, yeah, you have to go to Puerto Rico for the next 2 years. Like, wait, what? What do you mean?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like, I guess if you're going to be in the Army, this is not the worst possible assignment. You go down to this school, there's a sort of a gang of other English teachers who are also not really military people. They've all also been drafted, and you get called into this school. They're teaching, basically what's happening is they've brought all of these Puerto Ricans into the Army and none of them can speak English. And so this this school is for like cranking out, and it's not like they were like 6 week crash courses in English. And at some point, John Kennedy Toole says, like, we didn't really they didn't learn English. Like they learned hello, goodbye, couple simple questions. Yes, they learned, they could count to 10 or whatever, but they weren't really learning English. Nonetheless, there is tensions sort of happening. I mean, this is November 1961, where he comes into Fort Buchanan. Fidel Castro had been in power in Cuba for only 2 years, so the Bay of Pigs thing, I think happens in 1962. I don't think I have it written. Anyway, so Toole is in Puerto Rico for some of this sort of Cold War drama. He doesn't really get pulled into it. He never has to pick up a rifle. He's an English teacher, but he's next door to it. And, there's a little bit of paranoia. At one point, they do uncover a communist infiltrator at Fort Buchanan. So, it's sort of at the doorstep, but never really any kind of real significant risk. As Toole did every time he went someplace, he did really, really well. And I think after several months, I might have it here, but after a few months, he is now running the school effectively. He's teaching a couple classes, but mostly he's managing all of the other teachers. Is his job. Shortly after getting there. And again, we got to think he's not old. He's only 1961. He would be 24. So he's pretty young guy still, really. And but at the same time, it's like he was this highly motivated teacher getting his PhD from Columbia, and now he's in Fort Buchanan teaching a bunch of Puerto Ricans who he did not like. Wasn't really teaching them, right? Like, there wasn't enough time to actually teach them. They didn't really want to learn. It's just there's just not really much positive about this experience, right?
Yeah.
So let me read a couple of letters. I want to give you a sense of like, because here's the other thing. This is actually where in Puerto Rico is where Toole really learns to write. I think this is where he actually becomes Toole, the writer who ends up writing Confederacy of Dunces. And there's some interesting letters that he writes.
So this is kind of the bridge between the Neon Bible and Confederacy of Dunces, because he had to have grown as a writer at some point.
Yeah,
if
and
not continuously.
Right. And I don't think he was writing he wasn't submitting anything. There's no like short stories. There's not like a collection of short stories he wrote before this or something. It seems like he wrote Neon Bible, set it aside, followed the academic line, and then in Puerto Rico was like, all right, now I'm going to start writing.
Yeah.
I'm going to read a couple letters because he's writing a ton of letters home to mom and dad, mostly to mom. Here's one from early on. Let's see. We are in the middle of a cycle now. Fortunately, my current group of recruits is as pleasant as the others were. As I perhaps wrote before, these recruits are almost all volunteers, victims of unemployment in the mountains and as such are somewhat like characters from a Puerto Rican version of The Grapes of Wrath. One claimed he was a Cuban, an exile from Castro. However, it is developed that he was really from San Sebastian, Puerto Rico, and had read too avidly some stories of Cuba today. Now the class calls him El Cubano Artificial. In Puerto Rican pueblos, the usual number of stonings, incendiary suicides, and machete slings are taking place. The police are shooting innocent bystanders, and the bleachers in the ballpark collapse Sunday. Cara, que muchos accidentes, hey. I've been reading, and otherwise all is peaceful. I think that last bit is a joke, but it might have also been happening. It's like not clear. He's saying it in a funny tone, like the police are shooting innocent bystanders, and the bleachers in the ballpark collapsed Sunday. But like he's also saying, everything's good though. See you later.
Interesting.
Yeah. Here's another little bit. Monday, I was chosen to be Soldier of the Month of Fort Buchanan. Candidates were sent from every unit on post. A military board quizzed us on military subjects and knowledge and current events. We are also judged on appearance, bearing in uniform. For winning, I am to receive ... $10. It's just like, let's see if I can find another one. Let's see. As I was looking out of the office a few minutes ago, I saw an ambulance drive up to one of the Company B classrooms. The instructor of the class, whom I know, is a very passive, scholarly Yale graduate, and I suspected that he had finally passed out from asking, "What is this? Who are you? Do you like to eat fried chicken?" A moment or so later, the body of a trainee was brought out on a stretcher and slipped into the ambulance, while a group of excited trainees gathered around the scene, screaming in Spanish. And Mish, the instructor, looked on with his slouch and his permanently doleful expression, probably wondering how fate had brought him to this erratic island. Later, someone explained to me that the Puerto Ricans often pass out or suffer from closed stomachs whenever their diet is changed from rice and beans and dried salt codfish. And now I remember a trainee telling me about his experiences during his first days in Chicago. And then he goes on like this several sentence long, very dialecty Puerto Rican expression that I'm not even going to try to do, but it's like several sentences of him writing in like heavy Puerto Rican accent. And then he writes something in this in the same letter. He's referring to his father, and I know we haven't talked about his father much, but here's where he kind of comes back in. He's talking to his father. The new refrigerator looks wonderful. All those solid ice cubes and hard ice cream! ! I hope this model has no ice freer so that we can avoid the continual search and those doomsday warnings written on the kitchen wall in red Crayola. And I read that and I was like, what does this mean? Doomsday warnings written on the kitchen wall in red Crayola. It turns out John Sr. was losing his mind.
Oh yeah, I noticed that from your notes.
Yeah, and it had started out like it was happening gradually, and then like when Ken is in Puerto Rico, it like ramps up, and he's like hearing messages, and he's looking for listening devices, and he thinks every car in the street is like out to get him. He thinks people are honking at them. Like he becomes very, very paranoid, and is gradually starting to just like wander around the house, kind of lost in his own world.
Sad.
It really is. And you know, this is a guy who had been, because we said before, you know, he hadn't been a Columbia graduate or anything, but he'd been the state debate champion. And, you know, whatever we think about debate club or whatever, you know, that's a charismatic, extroverted kind of person who can participate in the world at the very least, right? And he's over time is just sort of lost. And Toole basically stops communicating with him to a certain extent because he kind of can't. There's a barrier, and John Senior's like doesn't talk to anybody hardly after a while.
Yeah. And of course, in that era, you know, mental illness was not treated. I mean, like, obviously, there are arguments about how mental illness is treated today, but certainly, I think we have a little more insight into schizophrenia and stuff of that nature.
Yeah, we at least now, like, whether it's the right thing or not, I think now somebody would say, oh, we should get him into a psychiatrist and like see if there's a solution for this. And then it was just like, well, that's what he does. Yep. So that's his life now, I guess. Yeah. So that pattern continues. Basically, think about that happening sort of in the background to all of this. Now I'll read a couple other things. Again, I think he's kind of developing some of his style here. He's writing a lot of letters and he seems to have time for it. Here's another one from later in 1962. Actually, the English instructors are in many ways a hilarious group. All college graduates, some with advanced degrees, they exist here in an alien society. During the inspections, several were used to cut grass and paint buildings, and they inadvertently lost one lawnmower, a lawnmower wheel, and a shovel. Our immediate superiors, all of whom are Puerto Rican, are wild and excitable and unpredictable, and the combination of English instructors and Puerto Rican cadre in an uneasy alliance full of sound and fury and improbably funny happenings. The incident of the missing lawnmower wheel was magnified so greatly that it almost split Company A asunder. As leader of the English instructors, I have a foot in both worlds with my psyche dangling between them. There's another part where he says something like, what will the world ever find to do with the Caribbean and Latin America? There's a bit here, since this is Art of Darkness, we should probably say it. Where did it go? Again, talking about his time in Puerto Rico. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it here.
Yeah, this is just such an interesting period for him. And then trying to think about him being in New Orleans, being so precocious. Mm-hmm. Did he get his PhD? And I'm sorry if I missed that.
No. Okay. We're going to get to that. Okay. So it's been split. I'm going to give a couple. There's one more sort of story about the time in Puerto Rico I want to get to.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And this, you know, I want to paint this picture of he's writing a lot of letters, you know, his personality is coming through. He does eventually get a typewriter that he borrows from somebody. And this is where and he finally gets an office based on his station, right? He's been elevated to being kind of a manager. He's like a sergeant major. I'm not good with military hierarchy. I don't know what's what, but he's in charge of a bunch of people. So he gets a little office, and that's where Confederacy of Dunces at least starts. But there's some weirdness happening too. So one thing that's going on here, it sounds kind of crazy. He gets really into drinking. Not that it's crazy to get that into alcohol in the military, but let me read this passage. This is talking about all of the people in his company. The most common complaint in the company, aside from a general feeling of aggravation, was headache. A primary cause of this was the fact the army in Puerto Rico seemed to promote inebriation. The soldiers and especially the instructors drank excessively. Booze was cheap and readily available on the post. There were free rum nights every week in the NCO club. Drinking in the barracks was continuous and caused no end of arguments and trouble in the ranks. Some instructors stayed intoxicated for days on end, and no one cared enough to reprimand them. Toole would have been a person who would have reprimanded them, right? He was in that position. Pharmaceutical drugs were readily available, and there was little control over the gallon-sized containers of medication. The most popular drug was 10 grains of aspirin laced with caffeine. Excuse me. This was known as APC or Emprin, or Emprin compound. These tablets were self-dispensed by the handful to alleviate chronic hangovers. Medications of all sorts were available on a take-as-needed basis. This rough, constant partying became a problem for Ken, who showed signs of becoming a heavy drinker even before coming to the island. In a letter to his friend Joel Fletcher, Ken describes the Army faculty as dissimilar draftees who shared an affection for liquor. He reports enjoying a few rums mixed with lemon and water at the end of the day, and also praises the village of Ponce along the southern coast for having a a hotel with a great bar and an excellent staff to dispense his favorite tropical libations. So drinking heavily, partying heavily. And then there's one other little aspect to this, other little quirk. Apparently, within the instructors, there's a sort of a clique develops that they're a bunch of gay guys. And they are, and you can imagine, try to imagine what this is like. It's the 60s. Imagine being a gay dude in the 60s, getting in the army, sent off to a tropical island, and then there's happens to be a handful of other young gay dudes around, and you have a job that has almost no responsibilities and free flowing alcohol. It's a little bit of a chaotic, a chaotic situation to have, and Toole is like responsible for these people. And he doesn't really know what to do with it. There's no indication that he participates in it, but he doesn't know what to do with it. And it's gradually going off the rails. And at the start of it, the other instructors who are, all these fairly liberal-minded people who are trying to be cool about it, it kind of develops. And at first it's like, okay, well, the gay guys in the company, they all hang out in their own thing and fine, whatever. But eventually the partying becomes too much. They become too loud. The flirtation and all that activity starts to spill out into the rest of the company, and all these tensions develop. And Toole, the guy who probably should have tried to rein this in and maintain some kind of military type order, doesn't do anything about it. And this all escalates to the point where at one point, there was some lover spat between two of these guys. And the one guy, maybe on purpose, maybe on accident, OD'd on this AMP stuff or APC stuff, this aspirin caffeine combination. And Toole finds him passed out, maybe dead, and like stands near the body waiting to see if he wakes up for maybe a half an hour. So this person that he's responsible for, right? He's this guy's sergeant or whatever, comes in, sees the body, and just kind of waits there. It's like, I don't know what to, doesn't do anything. And the other people eventually, luckily the guy lives. But I think there was like this tension or like, okay, hopefully he wakes up so we don't have to deal with this. If we have to deal with this, we have to explain why to some commanding officer someplace, why this place is completely off the rails. And it was Toole's responsibility to keep it on the rails, right? And so I think he had this like moment of crisis. Like, I can't, if I do the thing I should do, I'm going to get in more trouble. Anyway, it sowed a lot of, it made opinions about Toole within the company very negative. He was almost court-martialed for it.
Interesting.
Somebody apparently decided that like it was opening up a whole can of worms, that if they court-martialed him, all this stuff about it being a lover spat between these two guys and this gay clique and the company getting off the rails, all that would have to come out. And it was just easier to kind of keep it all under wraps. But
I would like to jump in and say that this parallels the experiences of Ignatius J. Reilly in the workforce. Reilly, both Reilly and the character Mr. Gonzalez, who was responsible for managing Levy Pants factory, actually more the character of Mr. Gonzalez, who was not able to control Reilly, and Reilly, led the crusade for Moorish dignity, which, upended the office and what have you. And in general, like there was a lot of focus in the novel on managers unable to control a spiraling situation that that also was ultimately not, the perpetrators were not adequately punished. Like Ignatius was fired, but he, very well could have been prosecuted or something. But I think in Dunces, they decided, or there was some allusion to the idea that like it would have been more trouble than it's worth and brought ignominy,
right.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Onto the whole affair.
Interesting. Yeah, he probably did. He probably did borrow a little bit of that for sure. Yeah. Interesting. And this is the same time period where he's starting to write Confederacy of Dunces. There's indications in his letters to his parents that he's writing something anyway. I don't even know if he'd arrived at a title yet. And he's typing away on this borrowed typewriter, apparently sharing some bits of it with a friend that he'd made in the army who thought it was quite good. And so, yeah, integrating, kind of bringing these aspects of the stuff that's actually happening around him. But again, you see that sort of refraction. It's sort of thematically something that happened in his life, but not actually something that happened in his life. And I think this is a good point. We're thinking about the part of the story where Toole is actually writing Confederacy of Dunces. I want to ask about Nutcracker a little bit.
Absolutely.
Some of these questions that I find interesting, I think other people find interesting too. What can you tell us about the process of Nutcracker? Like, maybe where did the idea come from? I know it's kind of a silly question sometimes, but like, tell us about how that came to be, what the process was like for you.
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is something that is perhaps not super unique, but many other writers do find my process to be somewhat unique. I just start writing. I mean, for literary fiction, I think it's a different story. But if I were writing commercial fiction, if I were writing a thriller, a Tom Clancy novel, if I were writing a screenplay or even a play, I would think more about structure. I would storyboard. I would this. I would that. But my process, my practice for writing Nutcracker or writing any literary fiction is to write until I find a voice that I like. And so I did that. I wrote until I found Ignatius's voice. And then I just started writing, and I saw where his voice took me. And so I would routinely stay, I would say, 2 steps ahead of not Ignatius, Spencer.
I was going to say,
yeah, there we go.
I would stay. Spencer is so insufferable. He's great. He's great. And
well, thank you. Yeah.
A lot of fun. Yeah.
Well, it surprises me to hear you say that you're not like doing a whole lot of outlining, because I actually think the plot of Nutcracker is actually quite strong in that, like, everything like leads to the next thing in a very
absolutely.
So
I mean, it does that. So I would write it, and I would stay like 2 steps ahead of Spencer, and I would like generally know where I wanted to take it. I had some ideas about, how it would, the climax and the eventual ending, but I, in general, let Spencer take me there. So if I came to a juncture and let's say he was supposed to seduce his ex-girlfriend's sister, and I'm there and I'm like, well, wait, she would never sleep with Spencer, I realized. Well, no, so that's going to go horribly wrong. That's going to, and so I had to be true to the character at every juncture. And that kind of takes you where you want to go as a novelist. That's my experience. So when I got to the end, the kind of twist, it has a real twist ending. That was not planned. That was just exactly.
I kind of wondered, almost like, if that was what I was reading. I almost wondered, and we don't want to give it away, obviously, but like, I almost wondered when I read it, I was like, I wonder if this is the first thing he came up with. Like,
absolutely.
And then the book, like, interesting.
If anything, and I think this is not too much to give away. He, the Spencer Grunhauer is, he has a romantic relationship of sorts with a socially progressive woman that he hopes to indoctrinate into his, very not just conservative, but very traditionalist worldview, and perhaps extreme and weird worldview in many respects. And he attempts to do this through a sort of erotic project that goes awry. And so she breaks up with him. He goes through a bit of a downward spiral, and it seems like it might be headed in a bit of an Elliot Rodger direction, shall we say. And I'm not going to give anything away, or I'm going to try not to, but as I was writing it, certain things just didn't make sense. And I just, I didn't know exactly where this spiral would end, where it would take him. But like, even if I had wanted to do something that was more like the ending of a Chuck Palahniuk novel, that wasn't really who Spencer was. That wasn't really who. And so, like, I find my process is to write in the voice of the character. The character will tell you where you need to go, where you're supposed to go. And what's more, you will never have a moment that is inauthentic, because that's what I hate when I'm reading something and I can tell that the writer, the author, is trying to figure out what the character would say or do, and there's this real disjunction between the words and the character. But it sounds like an almost woo-woo thing, but if you're in the mind of the character, you never have a false step. And what's more, if you have a funny character voice, that's going to carry through. And that's going to, a writing professor in college told me that you can never it all has to be the good part. You can't have pages. You can't have pages that are leading up to the good part. Every page has to be the good part. And when you are in the voice, in a character voice that's engaging, that's entertaining, every page is going to be the good part, because it's in that kind of voice that, you've judged to be interesting in its own right.
Sure. Yeah. Well, dude, I remember reading it and being, I don't know, 10, 15 pages in or so and laughing my ass off, but also having this thing like, how the hell is he going to be able to maintain this for the you know what I mean? That register, that voice is like, how is he going to, how is this book going to stay like this for this long? And I mean, you did it. And that was why I kept being impressed. But like, I remember that early on, like, man, this is like a high wire act I was as a writer, I was sort of on suspense. Like, is he going to be able to stay on this high wire for however many pages it is? Like, it's a tricky act to pull off, and you totally do. So kudos, man.
Yeah. No, I've had people say that, it's, they couldn't wait to get out of Spencer's head.
Yes.
So I think that is also like
that's a huge compliment.
Hopefully it's funny, but it's also like you're in the mind of this deranged guy for a very long time. I'm thank you
dude, I love it. We're gonna promote the heck out of it when it finally drops, for sure.
Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit more. We'll get back on the John Kennedy Toole train. He comes back to the United States. He's got kind of two priorities now. He wants to finish this book, and he wants to make some money, because he primarily needs money for his parents. And this is it's a little bit, he moves back in with his folks, and that's the last house that Toole lives in. So after this, being to New York, being to Lafayette teaching, being to Puerto Rico, Columbia for a PhD, he ends up living with his parents for the last years of his life. He gets he's working on finishing up the book. He gets a job at St. Mary's Dominican College. Which actually paid pretty well. And he was with his education, he was one of the more prestigious members of the faculty. And it was a pretty easy workload too. He was making decent money. I don't have a figure, but it was expressed as being pretty good money. And he's only teaching 10 hours a week. So it's not a crazy workload. He was really well liked there. They say, go where you're wanted. The nuns at the college adored him, apparently. He was very popular with the students, some of whom even developed crushes on him, which he didn't do anything about, of course. The faculty apparently knew he was writing this novel and were sort of cheering him on. So he has this moment where, like, he's got this book that's almost done. He's excited about it. He's at this job where he feels like it makes sense for him. He actually enjoys doing it. He's wanted to be there. He's good at teaching. He enjoys it. The book is good. People are excited about the book. He's almost like, he has this moment. There's this moment where he could almost become like this local legend a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Home from the war, Columbia grad, good boy, come home. All these things, it's sort of starting to happen. And then he's working on the book, and then he hits this roadblock. And I thought it was quite interesting. Let me read a little bit from this Neville's and Hardy biography again. This is 1963, and for those who are historically minded, you might know that something significant happened in 1963. The November 1963 assassination of President Kennedy devastated Ken. He became depressed, so depressed that he quit work on the book and began to drink quite heavily. Friends like J.C. Broussard saw Ken during this time and noticed this deep melancholy, but did not realize the cause. Some years later, Ken recalled this extreme reaction to Kennedy's death in a letter to Robert Gottlieb. We're going to talk a lot more about Robert Gottlieb. It was not until February of 1964 that Ken recovered enough to go back to the manuscript, so 3 months or so. He made no revisions, merely picked up where he had left off several months before. He typed what he had, tacked an ending on it, and mailed the manuscript to Simon & Schuster in New York. It was the first time that he had subjected his work to public scrutiny since the Neon Bible. He chose that company for a specific reason, which he later detailed in a letter to his editor. The novel came unrecommended, quote, over the transom, and fell into the firm's slush pile. In those days, Simon & Schuster was a small family-owned publishing house. The relationship between editors and the staff was warm and casual. Secretaries and assistants did the first readings of a manuscript. If the initial reader liked a book, he or she would then recommend it to an editor. So the fact, he sends it to Simon & Schuster, which is a huge publisher now. But at the time had a few kind of breakout hits. I think they had published Catch-22 and a couple of other books that went on to quite a bit of renown, but it wasn't the Simon & Schuster that we know.
I read that because I'm poking around in the background here, I read that he had a correspondence with Heller.
He may have, yes.
Okay.
Yes. I don't have any of those letters handy, but I think he probably did, because Heller was in the Simon & Schuster stable, and Robert Gottlieb is like, I think there was, how there's that Paris Review, the New Yorker interview series where they interview like the art of fiction, the art of poetry, whatever.
Yeah.
There's one, the art of editing, and it's Robert Gottlieb. So he's like he's a heavy in the world of editing, right? He brought Simon & Schuster from being this boutique little thing to what it became. He's still alive, 91.
I take it back. I misread what I had looked at. Gottlieb is responsible for Heller finishing Catch-22. He encouraged Heller to finish Catch-22.
That makes
Gottlieb
sense.
and well, you're going to get into it, but so you big time editor. Yeah. Cool.
I want to talk about a couple of other things too that are going on, because mostly from here on to the end, we're going to be talking about Confederacy of Dunces, the publication, the legacy, and the tale of publication, and then John Kennedy Toole sort of final moments, final years.
The last turn of the valve.
Right.
Oh, Fortuna. Fortuna.
Yeah, there's a couple. There's a couple little anecdotes, because I remember I'm very interested in this notion of John Kennedy Toole in his John Kennedy Toole land bumping up against the real world. He has a friend in the mid 60s burn out on acid, which I thought was interesting because you don't think of that in John Kennedy Toole world. One of the friends in this band that he bounced around with, the guy I think I mentioned earlier, Sidney Snow, who said that, we didn't even know that John went to Columbia. We just thought he was gone for a while. There's apparently this Sidney Snow was supposed to sit in with another band, and he missed rehearsal, and it turned out during rehearsal that band all shot up heroin, but it was a bad batch and the whole band OD'd.
Oh wow!
So his friend had narrowly missed this thing. So Toole is he's coming into the 60s. The 60s are sort of encroaching on his world. We saw that when he was at Columbia, when this like proto SJW stuff that doesn't really quite make sense to him. And then the drug world is kind of it's at the door, but it's there. All these things are there and around him. Meanwhile, he's writing. And so it starts to make sense how he can have a novel that's prescient. I think he was more participating in the world than maybe, at least in my mind, he was such an outsider that he was sort of, he was a hermit down in New Orleans who was cranking out this book. So we'll get into the publication thing. So I think the myth is John Kennedy Toole sends this book to publishers. Nobody wants it. He, depressed at the rejection, he kills himself. That's overly simplistic. He sends it to Simon & Schuster and Simon & Schuster only, and he gets a letter back from Robert Gottlieb. And I'm going to read you this letter. And just think about the fact, Dan, you're a novelist, and your book is coming out. It's going to be published by Terror House, right?
Yeah, by Terror House.
Very exciting. Now, you can imagine whoever the biggest shot editor in the world is. I don't even know who that is. I don't even pay attention to these things anymore.
Yeah, no, me neither.
But you imagine you got this letter from them, a couple of weeks after sending it out. It would be, let me see. Sorry, got to find my page. Let's see. Okay, so he's basically, I wish I could find this. Sorry. Why don't I have this section? Okay, so anyway, it starts out, I set this up and now I don't have it. Here's a little section. This isn't from a letter. No, hold on. I want to read that.
Well, Brad is getting on to this.
I know. I've lost my
let's just remind people, go and support the New Right podcast. Our friend Absolutely. Dan, for sure. It's Baltic _Dan. Yep, on Twitter for sure.
That's right.
On the Bird website, and then please do. Legitimately, we're trying to get our Patreon numbers up. We're trying to do cool things. We've got a Telegram channel. Go to artofdarkpod.com. All the links are there. If you're not, if you can't scrounge up $3 a month, I don't know what you're doing listening to 3-hour podcasts about writers of comic novels who suicided themselves. But if you're not feeling it, at the very least, seriously, go give us 5 stars on iTunes, Spotify. You can do the same. Leave us a nice little review on Apple Podcasts, whatever it is. That stuff adds up, and we really genuinely appreciate it. We love hearing from people. I know Brad just loves hearing from people on Twitter.
I do.
He actually does, and he's running that Twitter account in a really fun way. It's not just we don't just use it to spam you with each episode. No, hopefully it's not spam. He's finding different artists, and he's posting like adjacent things, and it's a whole little world you can get into with Art of Darkness, and I still think we haven't done this quite yet for 2 years. Season 3 kicks off next year, and you're still an early adopter if you get in now, particularly if you get in on Patreon. So seriously, consider it and support your effort pod.
I say this as someone with a literary podcast, New Right podcast. Your podcast is such an effort pod. You guys put a lot of work into this, and how awesome is it to be able to listen to episodes and come away knowing more or everything about a particular artist. So whoever is listening, you should be paying for this, because I have seen how much work goes into these episodes. It's roughly, I think I told Brad, 5x the work I do for my pod episodes. So support this, because this is better than anything that you're gonna watch on Netflix or listen to on NPR. So
right, and Netflix, thank you. Really appreciate that, Dan. And we're not on the right kind of sedatives to sound like NPR. And Netflix is never going to reach out and touch faith for you. You're never going to be able to reach Netflix on the phone. You can have a paraphilic relationship with us. You can find us on the Bird website and we'll be your friends. You can get in the chat. We're real people. Brad's in Michigan. I'm in Minnesota. Dan's in New York City. We bring on guests from all over the world, and we're just getting started too. I feel like we're journeyman Art of Darkness podcasters now, but we're still in it. And if you go back and listen to the back catalog, every episode is evergreen because the artists are all dead. Rest in peace and all of that. So and you can see the evolution of the show to the format and to the sort of style and the quality that we've arrived at here. And so we hope you enjoy the back catalog, and we hope to be here for another 4 or 5, as long as we, as various diseases and plagues and relationships and everything else, through it all, Brad and I are podcast husbands, and we're going to be here for you. Don't worry.
And
all right, I'm done. Yeah.
The guest the friend of the pod to guest pipeline is real. I mean, I had you guys knew right, but lo and behold, eventually I'm a guest on Art of Darkness.
Yeah.
So who knows? If you subscribe and become friends with Kevin and Brad, you might be where I am.
Might be on. That's right.
It's entirely possible. This is the new faculty party circuit.
I think that's what it is.
We're already doing it. So
that's right.
Very strange.
Yeah. Oh,
did I vamp enough for you to find your page,
great.
Brad?
I missed a little bit of setup that I wanted to do.
Okay, all right. Bring it back.
As you can see, I'm doing DJT hands because I'm trying to
rewind the tape.
Okay, so he sends it to Simon & Schuster. A secretary or assistant reads it. She loves it. She says, is in a letter to him where she's trying to set up a meeting or a phone call, at least with Gottlieb. She says, is now the time for me to tell you that I laughed, chortled, and collapsed my way through Confederacy? I did. So this assistant loved it. Then she gets it to Gottlieb. Gottlieb also quite enjoyed it, but he saw some flaws in it. And this was the beginning of, and fair enough, this is the beginning of a 2 to 3 year relationship of correspondence between Gottlieb and Toole, right? So it's not, flat no. This is what Gottlieb says in his first letter back to Toole. Anyway, in case I don't speak to you before I go, he's off to Europe for a while. I wanted to say one thing more about your book, having read your letter, and this is it. It seems to me that you understand the problem, the major problem involved, but think that the conclusion can solve it. More is required, though. Not only do the various threads need resolving, they can always be tied together conveniently. What must happen is that they must be strong and meaningful all the way through, not merely episodic and then wittily pulled together to make everything look as if it's come out right. In other words, there must be a point in everything you have in the book, a real point, not just amusingness that's forced to figure itself out. Does that make sense? I hope so, because it's vital. Please, no matter what, let me see the book again when you've worked on it again. I understand completely why you had to stop and put it aside. Get it finished at all costs. This happens even to editors. Books are sent to press that demand at least another go through because one simply can't look at them for another moment. A period away from the job usually does help, though. I hope to see you at some later date if we can't make it in June. Okay, now this is where it gets a little tricky.
That's a hell of a rejection letter.
It's not even really a rejection
letter.
It's
more than that. Yeah. It's like they're already working together.
Yes,
wow.
Exactly. And I think, as we'll see, it's tricky. Gottlieb has been criticized by some people for sort of leading Toole along.
Leading him on.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, it's like Toole isn't part of the publishing world. He's never tried to submit anything, really. Neon Bible when he was a kid, which was roundly rejected. He hasn't participated. He's blindly sent a book, and suddenly he's got the ear of who will be the hottest shot editor of his generation, right?
Yeah.
And this guy is saying it's good, but unfortunately, the but is pretty deep into the DNA of the book, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it's great, except it doesn't mean anything. So if you could work on that, it's like, well,
it's great, except all these random comical vignettes.
Right. Yeah. Which is like what the book is. And so
have you tried making your picaresque comic novel more dramatic,
right?
And satisfying in a dramatic way? Like what? You want a different,
Yeah, exactly. So I think this adds some pressure to Toole, whereas like maybe what he should have done is just gone to another editor. You know, just been like, okay, well, it's not for you. And if he'd been familiar with the publishing world, maybe he would have had maybe he would have had the wherewithal to have done that, and things would have gone a little differently. I don't know. I don't know that anybody except maybe Gottlieb would know how different that first draft that was sent over was compared to what ended up being published. Some differences were made. I don't actually think, based on these correspondences, that they were that substantial, to be honest. I think we're looking, the first version that's sent is something approximating what ends up getting published. But anyway, it goes back and forth. Now, John Kennedy Toole tells his people around him that he's got a lead with this editor. His mother blows this up immediately into this big thing. My son, the genius writer, who's got this big publisher in New York. It's just a matter of time now before he's a darling of the literary world and we're rich and all of these things. And you got that pressure. You've got that pressure he's had from his mother since day one. And now it's focused on this book that has been sort of rejected, actually, by this publisher. Or at least the feedback is such that it's almost impossible to respond to. Now, the letters continue on. They write back and forth to each other for a couple of years. In December of 1964, this is about 7 months after he submitted the first round, we've got another letter that's got a little bit of interesting from Gottlieb. This is so after Gottlieb has read the second round of submissions. I've taken a long time to get back to you, but not for want of thinking. And I still don't know what to tell you after thinking and after consultation with one person in town whose opinion I needed. In many ways, I think you've done an excellent job of pulling the plot together and of making sense of certain nonsense things, of strengthening certain characters, of eliminating certain others. The book is much better. It is still not right. Let me interrupt that to say that the other opinion I wanted was that of Candida Donadio, a young woman who's probably the best literary agent in town, one of my closest friends. She handles Joe Heller, Bruce Friedman, John Cheever, Nelson Algren, Thomas Pynchon, Harvey Swados, Philip Roth, ad infinitum. I wanted to know what she thought for various reasons, because she is the agent for you, because what you're good at would delight her, because her judgment is accurate, because frankly, if she and I can't figure out what to do with you, it's not likely that anyone else will be able to. Anyway, having introduced her, we talked for an hour on the phone Sunday night, and as often happens, had exactly the same reaction. Liked the same parts, didn't like the same parts, had the same doubts and the same excitements. Now, a little bit later in this, he says, let's see, certainly an editor can't say, quote, put meaning in, but which is all very well, but what to do? The book could be improved and published, but it wouldn't succeed. We could never say that it was anything. On the other hand, we can't abandon it or you. We won't abandon you. But we know from experience that when Candida and I know something is basically for us but not right, it is very difficult to have it right for other people in town. It is very difficult to have it right for other people in town on our wavelength, and the others are out of the question. So I don't know what to tell you. What I really would like would be to talk, but you are there, not here, and I'm not likely to be there soon. Is there a chance of your coming north? If not, and if you are not disgusted with me, perhaps Candida and I will figure out a next step, or perhaps you will. In any case, write to me without nervousness, because I am here for you, whatever way things work out. Let me know what you think. My own guess is that you will feel you can't do more on this book without specific editorial suggestion. I wouldn't blame you. If so, I'll try harder to think of something. Or if you give us up, tell me and I'll send back the manuscript, but I don't want to, and it wouldn't be a good idea. Or just brood for a while. Don't despair. Best, Robert Gottlieb. So it's in the hands of, this woman who is the agent of all these people, Pynchon and Roth, some of these people who weren't even quite those people as we think of them now, but right, heavies.
Yeah.
And the message is, we're not going to give up on you, but I don't really know what to tell you what to do.
Yeah, a sort of purgatory, which is almost more frustrating than if they had said, take a hike.
Yeah. Hearing that letter read, I just go, bro, just cut to the chase here. Are we going to publish this thing or not? Are we writing each other love letters? Like, what is this?
I don't know what to do. And we liked some parts of it. We didn't like.
They're not on our wavelength. And can you come north? And oh God, just publish it or don't.
Yeah.
Ugh,
Well, that's yeah.
gatekeeping, and I'm sure he's a brilliant man, but I mean, there is this style of just like,
yeah.
Geez.
No, I'm with you. I sat here reading this, thinking about, if I sent my book out to some heavy, and this is what I got back, what would I think? What would my reaction to this be? And
you would be over the moon for the attention, I think.
Yes.
And I think these guys know that. And so there is that weird kind of stringing along. The power differential is so unfair.
It's huge.
Yeah. Because he's not going to say, oh, screw it, I'll just, self-publish this. Because you couldn't do that in those days.
Right.
But I mean, he could have just walked it to someone else. But this guy was the hottest ticket in town.
Right.
So, there's like a real incentive to, stay with him, even though he's giving giving him this kind of like e-girl treatment.
right. And it's hard to know. It's like, well, not seeing the versions that Gottlieb's looking at, maybe Gottlieb had a point, right? Like, I don't really know. I mean, I just know the final version's this great novel, and maybe Toole in the end was able to get some stuff into there that's the sort of the finishing bit that really makes it work somehow. But like, you read this and you think as a writer, like, well, okay, I could just say, screw you, I'm going across town, but maybe he's actually right and I should listen to him.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you figure out like which of those is the way to go? Like, maybe if I go across town, I'm like short selling myself because I could work on it for another 6 months. And really, it just puts you into this crazy kind of situation. Whereas Gottlieb probably should have said, sorry, not for us. Now we know certainly now that if there's a sentence that's not liked by an agent or a publisher, that's it. They don't, you're done. Like, I mean, I know this from experience, having worked with like a lot of agents and publishers. It's just like, they don't have time to no one's going to write you anything this long.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The young, handsome, potent, virile podcaster wandered into the offices of Simon and Schuster, fully loaded with an AR-15. Do I have your attention?
Dude, in 2022, if they were going to publish you, they wouldn't write you a letter this long.
No, absolutely.
Even if you got a deal, it would be like, oh, this is great. But, like it's kind of crazy just the degree of correspondence that's happening here and his interactions with this Gottlieb guy.
Well, it goes to like, they actually do want to publish a polished, or, for whatever it is, he wants to make this a great novel, this Gottlieb guy. And like that, you don't see that in the industry today. They want to get, I think we all know what the issues are, and they want a novel that checks the boxes and it's, well, good to go. We got, the picture matches, this matches, that matches, you're stamped. And like, for all the, like dithering here, it does seem what seems to be going on. And I've had people have said the same about Nutcracker to me, not in a way that was really, too harsh, but there is a sense among many readers that a comic novel is not a serious novel. That like, if you want a novel that is important, that stands the test of time, it has to be more than a comedy. Something like that. And I don't think that's true. I think that Dunces was a masterpiece. And I'm not going to, I can't, say that about my own writing because I'm a biased party, but
it's a very similar dynamic in the theater where nobody goes into these grad programs or even these young writing programs, writing comedies really. It just doesn't, it's just not done because it doesn't get you awards. It doesn't get you the fellowships. And it's a pity because we live in clown world and we desperately need art that reflects how absurd and hilarious the situation is. Desperately.
Oh yeah.
With new voices,
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Real new voices.
Right. So Toole is in this. I mean, Toole's in this. I guess his life is sort of prescient in a way, right? Even.
Absolutely.
And here's the thing that he writes. This is his next letter. After that letter, and this is months go by. So the last letter was, let's see, December December 1964. A month later, he writes Gottlieb. Toole writes Gottlieb. The only sensible thing to do, and this is after much despair and banging his head against the wall, not sure what he's going to do, and mom saying, "Oh, did you get the book deal yet?" and blah 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 blah. The only sensible thing to do, it seems to me, is to ask for the manuscript back. Aside from making some deletions, I don't think I could really do much to the book now. And of course, even with revisions, you might not be satisfied. I can't even think of much that I could do to the book. So there's little point in you being burdened with a manuscript. Will you send it to me? I must say very honestly that I've been fortunate in having the manuscript receive your notice. I hope that you'll be willing to look at anything I might send in the future. All right. So there's this sense of which he gave up. Now, Gottlieb writes back to him. Gottlieb doesn't really want him to give up, but he doesn't really give him a very good. He's like, on the one hand, he doesn't want him to give up, but he's also not really telling him like what we're going to do. At one point, Toole goes up and tries to meet him in New York, like surprise visit him in New York, but Gottlieb's out of town because he's off in Europe or something, and he's not able to meet Gottlieb, and he thinks. Toole thinks, and this is, I think, a very kind of poignant metaphor for what's going on here. Toole thinks that he's made this like very cringing, embarrassing impression that he like ranted to them, to the woman there. And when Gottlieb comes back, there's like a note that's been left by Toole for Gottlieb. Nobody remembers Toole even being there, and so
it's really in his head.
Yeah. Exactly. And so he writes this letter of like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I know I embarrassed myself, and I hope that, I hope I didn't ruin this relationship that you and I have, yada, 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 yada." And it's kind of sad. Here's a letter from Gottlieb about that.
Miss him, just want him back.
Right. Here's a letter from Gottlieb. And there's another letter where Toole is kind of spilling his heart about like, I don't know what to do. I love these characters. I love this book. I don't know what to do. Gottlieb writes back to him, "I can't say much sensible to you about your mortifications over your performance on the telephone with me." So Toole must have said something on the phone that he felt later he was embarrassed about, or here in the office. 6 years of analysis haven't robbed me of my own brand of insecurities or neurosis, and why should I try to rob you of yours? But remember that if to you we are threatening figures in a complicated and confusing world, to us you are an attractive and important mystery. You don't have to put yourself on the line in person, since you have done your job on paper. We are the ones who have to appear and behave strongly and well. Besides, silence never seems frantic. It didn't occur to me that you were anything but cautious and relatively easy and pleasant about accepting criticism from a total stranger. So Toole had put on a good show of like saving face inside turmoil and, confusion and desperation. Later in the same letter from Gottlieb in March of 65. About the book, everything you write about makes sense to me, including your doubts and your ultimate determinations. Since we agree on what is real and what isn't, there's not much point to recounting the areas I approve and disapprove of. You know them before I mentioned them. As you explain yourself, I see that it is essential that you work on into the book, and I'm glad you are. My words, quote, "it wouldn't succeed," quote, end quote, I can't tell you now what I meant by them. So he told him that it wouldn't succeed, and that meant something as a book publisher different than it did to a writer. Later on in the same letter, and then I'm going to not read so many. I'm going to read one more letter from Toole, and then it's not going to be so much of a letter. It's just the whole story of it plays out in these letters. From Gottlieb to Toole in the same letter. "I don't know just what I've said here, and I don't know that I want to turn back to see. What I want basically to have said is this: you have nothing to apologize. You are a good writer and a serious person and are doing your job seriously and modestly, and of course it isn't easy. And as for the actual rewrite, I tell you, as I have already told you, I will never abandon you. A writer's decisions are his own, not his editor's. If you know you have to continue with Ignatius, that is, of course, what you should do. I will read, reread, edit, perhaps publish, generally cope until you are fed up with me. What more can I say? Please write me short or long at any time, if only to say that you're working or not. Or if you like, show me bits of what you've done. Or don't, whichever would be more useful. Cheer up. Work. We are overcoming." Okay. Now, this wasn't particularly helpful. A couple days later, Toole writes a very long letter about all of the things. He starts spilling his beans about the Neon Bible and the John F. Kennedy assassination and the effect it had on him, and all these things, like all this sort of stuff in his head about writing this book. It becomes not about the book anymore. It becomes about John Kennedy Toole, right?
Yeah.
Because he's lost, I think, any ability to change much about the book at this point. And so he's sort of like trying to rationalize, but he has one person, weirdly enough, the only person he can talk to about writing and the writing process is now this Gottlieb guy. He's not surrounded by other writers. He doesn't have friends like that. And he's in this purgatory, as you said. So it's kind of a tricky situation. It's definitely a tricky situation. Here is, I think, this last letter from Gottlieb, the last paragraph that Gottlieb wrote to Toole. I didn't think your purpose in writing me was vague. This was another letter where Toole like spilled beans about a bunch of things, about the purpose of the book and all these other things. I didn't think your purpose in writing me was vague. Everyone wants to feel outside professional interest in what he's doing. Writing, quote, writing, we live on it. But you are not working in a void, not as far as New York publishing is concerned. At least this editor is interested and hoping that you've made the right choice in continuing with this book rather than starting something new. But that decision has been made. Now to see what you do with it. Toole had decided, all right, I'm going to make this thing what Gottlieb wants. And then, frankly, he just doesn't. He doesn't really work on it much anymore after that.
He was done. It sounds like he was done. He was happy with the book.
Pretty much. He wanted Gottlieb to publish it is the thing, and he saw it as his last chance. He didn't at the time, he didn't really have a notion for another book yet, though it turns out that he was starting to work on another book. So nothing happens with the book. It goes on a shelf, right?
Yeah. Because he wrote a full and complete book. And he had no idea how to, it was essentially like Gottlieb was telling him, you needed to write a different book.
Yeah.
And I think it sounds like one of the issues is he didn't have a community of other writers and, and other, publishers and, people to talk to. So he probably placed a lot of stock and credence in Gottlieb's opinions. And he, probably thought, well, what I think is a good book, my values, my taste is compromised because this guy who knows everything about taste says it's not good enough.
Right.
And that probably, I think would have been a crushing blow to him because it compromises the very thing that he needs to write, which is his sense of taste, his sense of what is good and what is bad.
Right. No, very well put. Very well put. So the years after this, January 1966, thereabouts, he keeps working at Dominican. He's still teaching at Dominican. But he doesn't really know. He's still living with his mom, who's kind of pestering him all the time and still wants him to be this great writer. There's a sort of a final blow in late of 1966 where Thelma cajoles Toole into taking his book, Confederacy of Dunces. This is the last gasp, taking it to this publisher, Harding Carter Jr., who's coming to Tulane as a writer in residence. JTK takes it. JKT. I kept writing JTK, and I just now realized that that's not right. That's funny. I probably wrote it a dozen times in these notes. To take this manuscript to him, and Harding Carter basically is like, I don't know. Like, maybe I could do something with it, but makes no commitment whatsoever. And Toole takes this as like more of a rejection than even Gottlieb, because there's no positivity to it. And this is actually starts. There has been obviously a split growing between Thelma and Toole all this time, but they'd always been kind of friendly. They would hang out and they would talk and they would drink, as difficult as she was to deal with. But after this rejection by Harding Carter, Toole's like, that's it. I'm not dealing with mom anymore. Like, I'm not going to talk to her. She's not my friend. We're not going to have conversations. This is where they really kind of break up in a
Interesting.
In a way. Yeah.
Interesting that it would be over that. It seemed, I mean, I'm sure there were other issues.
Yeah, it was all adding up to that. It was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back. It was like he had accepted his rejection and then she pushed him into it again and he faced it again. And I think it was just too much.
Okay.
As we get into and here's what starts happening now. 67, 68. We're coming to the end. 67, 68. Toole starts getting more and more paranoid. He starts being like his father was. Becoming less and less rational. The neat compartments he had built into his life start to kind of fall apart a little bit. I'm going to give you one example here real quick. Again, from the Neville's and Hardy biography. Sorry, I got the page here. This is he's driving with his friend Dave Kubak. One afternoon while driving around the city, this is like 68. One afternoon while driving around the city, Ken checked his rearview mirror and said he was sure they were being followed by a car. He said the woman driving and her passenger must be students from Dominican. Kubak recalled that quickly we took evasive action. John drove down a couple of alleys and made a couple of swift turns and proudly mentioned that he had eluded him. Kubak thought Ken's reaction to the supposed pursuit was odd. He said that had he been single, Kubak would have been flattered to have young women chasing after him, but Ken's view is that they were to be gotten rid of. And then one more. Let's see. The only change, this is a student that had taken him many, many times. She noticed a change in him. The only change she noticed in him was that his humor had become more pointed and political. The radical 60s had only served to strengthen Ken's intolerance for institutional hypocrisy, but though the times were liberal, the climate of the Deep South was not. Stovall said Ken's mockery of religion and the foibles of Louisiana politicians upset some of the young women in the class who did not see the humor in making fun of how fast nuns could say the rosary. Although his classes remained full of devoted followers, Ken's acid wit was playing the wrong crowd. Later, he would see a doctor to try and he would get some medicated for like his nerves. They didn't know what to do with these things back then, but he would get very paranoid, and he, like his father, would start looking for listening devices. He would start thinking that cars passing in the street outside their house at night were stalking them.
Interesting.
Yeah, it got very, very paranoid, and it wasn't rational. And he explained. Go ahead.
Well, Kevin. I mean, was he ever diagnosed with anything? Did he have like late onset, like schizophrenia?
No, not specifically. No? I mean, we'd only be speculating. He had a doctor that prescribed him some butyl sodium, which is it's a butabarbital. I don't even know what it is. It's some kind. It was like the only thing that they would prescribe at the time for quote nerves.
Yeah.
Right? And if you got some kind of paranoid delusions, it's not really nerves. It's not anxiety, and I didn't really have an understanding of the distinctions between these things.
I mean, there is a strong, as I'm sure you both know, hereditary component to schizophrenia.
Oh yeah,
and and sometimes, though it mostly, I think, surfaces in late adolescence, it can surface later in life.
Yeah, and who knows how long? I mean, there's just like anything, there's got to be varying degrees of it too. I mean. Maybe he was really wrestling with this stuff earlier, and he just, managed to keep it under wraps, managed to compartmentalize his life, right? I'm crazy.
Prodigious drinking does not help. So if he's continuing to do that, can certainly, it can make you hear things.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to read one more thing. This is from actually Bob Byrne, the guy who inspired Ignatius Reilly. Page 161. Okay. This is in 1995. There was an interview with this Bob Byrne guy, who obviously is much older now, and he's talking about Toole. Well,
careening into the fourth hour here.
Oh, yeah.
In our pod. Very, very well done, Brad. Okay. Set us up again. So who is this talking?
This is Bob Byrne. This is the guy who inspired Ignatius Reilly. And this is in a 1995 interview. He's talking about Toole. Well, he was going into paranoia. He was living in that house with his father and that overbearing mother. This was on Hampton Street between Tulane and Broadway. Ken's problem was that he was extremely parsimonious. Money hagged him, and he worried. What he really wanted to do was to make enough money to go to New York again. I think he thought New York was the center of the world. He was going to go there and take care of his parents, so he could get rid of that obligation. He came here and we talked. My little brother was with us blah, blah, blah. Toole had gone into therapy, but evidently it didn't work. I remember the windows were open. It was hot. He walked over. He said that people were passing his house and honking, that people were plotting against him. It was pure paranoia. I talked to him, and by the end, he seemed pretty stable. He said, yeah, maybe it was all his imagination. That was in August, and then I didn't see him at Christmas. I wasn't in that long, but my brother said, Ken's going mad. I said, yeah, he's in a bad way. That was my little brother's comment. He was well into paranoia, and part of it was the book. It was a tremendous frustration. He was defeated. He was frustrated. He was completely disoriented. He was just, because the book was his, I think he pinned a lot of his hopes on it. Of course, they had encouraged him to begin with. Then he got an editor, and the editor objected to the picture of the New York Jewish girl or something. They said it was anti-Semitic or something, but she's a typical hunter girl. Other things like that, and Burma Jones and the guy at Schuster were giving it a bad time. It was the 60s, and the book isn't politically correct. He was thoroughly frustrated and utterly defeated. Now, this is one time, there's two people. Gottlieb never says anything about this in any of the letters, right? If he loved the book but was like, hey, it's a little anti-Semitic, I think he would have said either no, or he would have said, hey, can you just make it less anti-Semitic and then we'll publish it? Like,
you're telling me Gottlieb isn't a Catholic? Right. So you're telling me the New York publisher with lots of opinions? Okay.
Right. Would he have carried on a 2 to 3 year correspondence if he thought the book was like fundamentally anti-Semitic?
Sure.
I doubt it. Right. Yeah. But Thelma would rant about how this Jewish publisher in New York City was trying to hold him back because he was a Catholic. Right. She like wound it up into conspiracy theories and probably got Ken wound up into it, too. And so there were like some of the stories got very paranoid about like they ended up rejecting it because there was another writer in Louisiana that they were going to give the book to and publish it under his name. Like all these like paranoid delusions started building up. And, because he's losing his mind. Frankly, he's whatever we want to say. He's losing his grip on reality. Now, eventually, he has a fight with his mother. There's some dispute about what this fight actually was about. But whatever the case, in January of he hadn't been showing up. I think what it was he stopped showing up to work at Dominican, and then they replaced him, and so he basically was unemployed. And his mother gave him a hard time about this. He was basically providing for the family at this point. And in January 19th, 1969, Toole walks out of the house, withdraws $1,500 from his bank account, and other than one run-in he has with a friend, he's not seen again for 2 months. He goes on this road trip. He purportedly makes it to California, though very little is known about where exactly he went and when. Thelma claimed that they had a ticket in his jacket that he'd gone to the Flannery O'Connor house, which apparently you couldn't even do. Like, she made up some legend about him. It's very strange. But anyway, 2 months after he left, approximately, there's a report of a suspicious vehicle by the side of the road in Biloxi, Mississippi. I'm going to read this bit, and then we'll talk briefly about the publication, how they got it published, and then I think we're kind of good. 169. This is finding the car. It was a warm, clear spring afternoon, and the temperature had climbed into the mid-80s. The white Chevelle was backed onto the side of a gravel road surrounded by pine woods. What caught Diaz's eye was the bright green garden hose running from the exhaust pipe to the rear driver's side window. As soon as he spotted that, Diaz knew he was dealing with a serious situation. Diaz is the police officer that was dispatched to the scene. He parked in front of the Chevelle and walked toward it with the glare of the sun in his eyes. Even before he could see into the car, Diaz smelled death behind its doors. Ken's body was sitting behind the wheel. His head was tilted back, resting on the seat. He was neatly attired in a white shirt, dress pants, and a tie. He had a stack of papers next to him. It's not clear what all was in there. There was parts of a book that he might have been he was working on called The Conqueror Worm. Very little is known about that book. Those papers were all lost in a hurricane a couple of 6 months later, which weirdly enough happened to his schoolboy records too. Were lost in a hurricane. Something about living in this part of the South. The
most New Orleans thing ever. This is just peak.
Right. and that was it. I mean, he had a funeral, 3 people, his mother, his father, and a nanny he had grown that had been around for part of his childhood. That was it. It's a suicide. It's a Catholic family, so a lot of the extended family thought that they had brought shame on him, and he's not the John Kennedy Toole that we know, as the writer of this great book. He's just a guy.
Yeah.
He's a dude who, had some success, but ultimately couldn't handle it, whatever. One thing that's kind of screwed up, there was a suicide note. Thelma destroyed it.
Yeah, I remember hearing that and thinking it was quite unusual.
Yeah.
Wow, what a crime.
So can you imagine? I mean, it was probably about her.
Yeah,
at least
I
in
would
part,
have to think so.
right? And maybe not entirely, but at least in part, it was about her. Now, some years would go by, and eventually Thelma's fortunes take a worse and worse turn, right? John Toole's gone. John Sr. dies. There's not really any money coming in. She ends up living with her brother, who seems like a very sweet guy. But she's so abrasive with him that they won't talk. They live in the same house and they won't talk to each other. Because her brother hates him. He hates her. Even though he's like this sweet Catholic guy who goes to church every single day, he's just like, I can't talk to her. Eventually, Thelma gets her hands on this book. She realizes it's a work of genius. This is the book that my genius son wrote, right? And she takes it to Walker Percy, who's a famed Southern writer in his own right. And Walker Percy, sort of having this pressed on him by this kind of insane woman who's very persuasive and very demanding, right? And doesn't know any boundaries, really, decides in his gentlemanly way that he'll try to read a few pages. He figures, hey, if I can read a couple pages and say legitimately that this is not a good book, then I'm done with her, right?
Yeah.
He reads it and he thinks it's incredible.
Yeah.
Right. So, though, this is the other thing, too. She had latched on to Walker Percy because he's a well-known writer and he happened to be in town. Just because somebody is a writer doesn't mean they have any means of getting anything published, right?
Yeah,
That's a whole,
tell me about it.
Right. It's a whole different ball game, right? So eventually they do manage to get it done, and it's a lot of craziness. Like, they have to figure out, well, who does the money go to? Are there other extended family members who should get it? Who's going to publish it? It was going to come out on Simon and Schuster, which is this kind of shishi boutique publisher. It ends up coming up on LSU Press, who had never published a novel before. They published academic texts and that sort of thing. Thelma doggedly pursues this, right? Like, is very persistent, gets people involved, and starts to get, here's what I think happened. Thelma sees a couple of things. She sees, one, the ability to redeem herself in the memory of her son. I think, to simplify it, in my opinion, what happened is there's a letter, a suicide note that blames her. And she thinks if she can get this book published, she somehow redeems what that note said to her, right?
Yeah.
And then there's, for her narcissistic tendencies. She gets to thrust herself in the spotlight. Her son is a genius. He's not around, so she's kind of a genius.
Yeah.
And so she gets to sort of position herself that way. And as soon as the book hit, she was everywhere. She was at all of the book release parties. She was signing books. She was getting interviewed on local television. She was getting interviewed in the local newspaper. Like, she put herself everywhere that she could, which I guess was good for book promotion, but it was clearly she was doing stuff for herself. There are stories about people coming to interview her, and she's like, well, how about I play you a little song on the piano? And she would start like playing them like old timey show tunes. And they're like, we're trying to talk about this book. Like, what is this lady doing? Right. And anybody who wronged her went on her list immediately. And she would expect people to adhere to these old fashioned rules of decorum and etiquette. So, like, at one point, she's at a party, some kind of book release party or something, with Walker Percy, and Walker Percy isn't paying attention to her. He's probably sick of her at this point. And she writes him a letter and says, I can't believe you were so rude to me and you didn't ask me how things were going. Here's a check for $1,000 for your services. Consider our relationship over. Right. And it's just like, she's just this like insane person. But nonetheless, and we got many anecdotes, but I know we're going long. She's an interesting figure in her own right. that's kind of where it ends. I mean, the book in what year was it? 1983 ends up winning the Pulitzer Prize. Was it 1983 or 1981?
Maybe 81.
I think it was 81. You're right. Yeah. Thelma died in 84. And it's a hit. I mean, it sells out its first print run. It sells out print runs after that, and it's an absolute runaway hit after that. It's clearly it's never been out of print, and its reputation has only grown since then. And I think we can attribute that to Thelma in a way, because it would have just sat on a shelf. It would have been maybe in Gottlieb's memoirs. It would have been mentioned or something. But other than that, would have totally disappeared. And, unfortunately, we didn't get another book out of it. I only wish he would have, gone to another publisher or
well, that's the thing that strikes me. This is effectively his mother approached the second person who was ever approached about this book. Mm-hmm. Now, if Kennedy Toole had, not had his hopes, had his spirit not been crushed by the, essentially rejection by Gottlieb, he just shopped it around a little bit.
Right.
He would have, why would he have not have found the same success that, okay, this is like a real selling point. The dead by his own hand artist, the grieving mother. This is like, and I'm sure in her mind, Thelma thought, somewhat like, well, this actually is this is a good story behind a novel. Yeah. And that is true, but it's a great novel. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure if Kennedy Toole had, shopped it or had the confidence to keep going, he would have, it would have seen the light of day in his own life, and he perhaps would not have taken his own life.
Right.
This is a lot of projection, but
of course, even if it hadn't been Confederacy, maybe he says, okay, well, I guess Confederacy didn't work, but man, this publisher really thinks I've got something. Maybe I just need to write another book. Some other route, and then Confederacy comes back around anyway, because he's now got some other book. But yeah, unfortunately, we just never get to see. It's such a disappointment that we don't get to see him fully come into his full. I mean, Confederacy of Dunces is a monument. It's a huge book, but to think that he could have had another 30 or 40 years career to write another half a dozen or a dozen books is we missed out for sure.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that Matt and I speculated about in our episode. Why was Kennedy Toole, why was it so hard for him to get his work out there? Why was he an outsider? And of course, there's many reasons for that, but some of it is just kind of like I know why I'm very happy that Nutcracker is being published by Terror House, but I know why I am not an insider. I know that my type of fiction will not be published by the mainstream industry. Yeah. That wasn't true in John Kennedy Toole's day. His fiction was eminently publishable by the mainstream publishing industry.
And he had something of a pedigree. I mean, you're talking about a guy working on his PhD at Columbia.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a whole litany of novelists who've come out of Columbia PhD programs that have Wikipedia pages,
Yeah. And he, that is as great a mystery as anything else. Mm-hmm. Why he, he started this correspondence with Gottlieb, and he, I guess found himself in a sort of circular pattern and some sort of, odd relationship that eventually led to his giving up. And he really should not have.
Don't give up. Don't give up, people.
Don't give up.
WGMI. Yeah, gonna make it.
That's right.
That's it. We're all gonna make it, baby. Yeah. Well, Brad, as ever, core episode. Very well done, very well researched. I know so much more about John Kennedy Toole. Dan, thank you for your insights during the episode and for doing a bit of reading. I can't wait to get my copy of Nutcracker. You're going to want to read that to understand why the title makes sense. He explained it, but you really want to get there because there's a setup where he might actually get his nuts cranked, so it's not entirely clear. And one final time. Well, we've got to close out with the closing question, then plug Patreon, then we'll do the After Dark.
Yeah. So Kevin, well, I guess who's getting asked the question?
Let's ask our guest first. The question. So we sandwich every episode, when we don't forget, with an opening and a closing question. So here's the closing question.
What would John Kennedy Toole be doing now if he were still alive?
I think he'd be writing Nutcracker.
Yeah.
So. But no, he would be. I think he'd find real grist for the mill in the current political moment. He anticipated it so well that, he would be writing the great comic novel, the great right-wing, or not even necessarily right, but on the right, there is a sort of sense of like, we need an updated version of Bonfire of the Vanities. We need, his skills and his outsider kind of mentality is just very well suited for the current moment. So he would be writing that novel. And in fact, I think he kind of did. I think Dunces is really the novel for our time.
Yeah. Well said.
I'll follow on that and say, yes, I agree. I also think he'd be edgelording. I think he probably under his own name.
I think he might have an alt that is like Spencer Grunhauer level crazy, just as like for fun. That is, an alt, and then have his own John Kennedy Toole, where he's like wearing a suit.
I don't think he gets a blue check. No. I think he eschews the mark of the beast, and he could do some epic trolling. Trolling. Yeah, it does not surprise me that he was. Would they describe him as a wit? Yeah, they did.
Oh yeah,
it does not surprise me at all. He must have been fun he'd be fun in the podcast party circuit as well.
Sure, storyteller and absolutely,
and potentially homosexual, which we're going to talk about when we come back for the After Dark episode for Patreon subscribers only. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod. What's the final takeaway? I think we just reiterate, right? Like, don't give up.
Don't give up, man. Yeah.
WGMI.
WGMI. Keep at it, man.
Yep.
And what are you going to do? Not keep going? Like, what are you going to do?
Right. Yeah.
You got to do
it. Just keep swimming, baby. I have the show title. I think, should we call it John Kennedy Toole's Edgelord Confederacy, or should we call it John Kennedy Toole Edgelord of Dunces?
I like them both.
Edgelord Confederacy. I'm gonna go with that. Yeah,
with a colon in there.
I'm just gonna go John Kennedy Toole's Edgelord. Okay. Yeah, Toole's Edgelord Confederacy. Brad, thank you, my man. We got some good stuff coming up. I'm getting Crowley prepped, Mr. Crowley.
Oh, it's gonna be a banger.
I'm getting my.
That's like one. That's one that could be like 6 hours long.
Oh, bro, we don't even know. I mean, nobody has any clue. There's still stuff coming out. Was he a double agent? Was he what the hell was that guy?
So. That sounds
fun.
Oh,
but I got the book specifically for that. So stay tuned. Smash that like button. Give us 5 stars. Get on the Patreon. We love you. Mwah, 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 mwah. Thanks again.
And look out for Nutcracker coming soon.
This was awesome.
Yeah.
Nutcracker Terror House Press coming 2022. Get it. And again, we're whispering about a book club for the Patreon, and we may include Nutcracker in the book club. So stay tuned. All right.
I hope so.
That'd be fun. All right, man.
All right. Thank you guys. Yep. This was great.
Thanks, Dan. Bye.
Bye.